The flesh was pale, unbroken, soft as sleep. The air should have smelled of rot. Instead, it smelled of roses. That was how the monk described it. The first body he ever saw that refused to decay. It was the year 1273, and deep beneath the marble floors of a cathedral in Rome, a coffin was opened after a century of silence. The body within should have been dust and bone. Instead, it lay untouched, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, fingers still clasped around a rosary that had not crumbled. The monks knelt in awe. Some wept. Others whispered prayers, afraid they stood before something not of this world. The story spread faster than plague. God has preserved her, the priests said. Her flesh is proof of her purity. And thus began one of history's strangest obsessions, the veneration of bodies that refused to rot. The Middle Ages were not kind to the body. Death was everywhere, in battlefields, in alleys, in monasteries, in the very air people breathed. To live was to watch decay. Flesh meant fragility. The grave was not metaphor, it was the inevitable ending written in every face. But when death followed its rules, and one day refused to, the people saw only miracle. Church bells tolled in towns that had never seen light like this. Bodies were exhumed, examined, displayed. Those who did not decompose were said to have achieved incorruptio, divine incorruption. It was a sign, they said, that the soul had been too pure for the worms to touch. In a world drowning in decay, the unrotting flesh of a saint was the promise of hope made visible. Imagine the candlelit crypt, a line of pilgrims kneeling in silence, hands pressed to cold stone, a glass coffin glimmering faintly in the dark, and inside it a face that still seemed to breathe, the air thick with incense and whispers, the living staring into the uncorrupted dead, searching for proof that heaven was not a dream. For the medieval church, miracles were not abstract. They were tangible, measurable, and, when necessary, exhumable. When word of an incorrupt saint spread, bishops sent investigators. They opened graves, studied flesh, took notes. They smelled for the odor of sanctity, a fragrance said to emanate from holy corpses, sweet as lilies and spice. If the scent was foul, the miracle was false. If it was pure, the verdict was divine. No scientific method, no lab reports, just faith and the nose. One report from the 14th century described the body of Saint Clare of Assisi. Her eyes were bright as morning, her flesh soft as a child's, her lips red with the memory of breath. Witnesses swore they saw her smile when the coffin opened. They said her face glowed faintly, though no candle touched it. The Pope declared it proof of sainthood. And just like that, incorruptibility became a currency of holiness, a sign that heaven had claimed a body before the earth could. To understand the obsession, you must first understand the terror. Death in the medieval world was not peaceful. It was violent, physical, public. People watched bodies rot in real time. They saw plague corpses stacked in carts, blackened and split open. They smelled decomposition in the streets. To be human was to know what the body would become. So when one did not decay, when flesh defied its fate, it wasn't merely surprising. It was salvation. The incorrupt saints were not just admired, they were envied. They represented the one thing everyone desired, but no one could buy: eternal preservation. not of the soul, but of the skin. In frescoes, saints were painted radiant and whole, their bodies luminous and untouchable. In sermons, priests spoke of incorruptibility as a reward for purity. Live without sin, and death will not claim you. It was both promise and threat. Heaven might spare your flesh, or the worms would feast as proof of your guilt. Soon, cathedrals became stages for the spectacle of sanctity. Bodies were dressed in silk, crowned with gold, laid in crystal coffins. Pilgrims came from across continents to see what God had preserved. Some brought offerings, coins, candles, locks of hair. Others brought questions. Was this truly divine, or was the church making profit from flesh? The priests answered in incense and silence. The people believed what they needed to. Records from 15th century Venice described crowds pressing so close to the relics of St. Lucy that soldiers had to drive them back with pikes. In Seville, the incorrupt body of a nun drew so many pilgrims that her convent became a marketplace. Stalls selling rosaries, candles, relics, even pieces of her habit. Her body became an economy. And yet, not all were convinced. Some scholars whispered that the church had found ways to help the miracles along, preserving bodies in oils, resins, or lime before declaring them divine. But to question a saint was to question God, and that was a dangerous thought in the age of faith. The truth, as it often does, lived somewhere between wonder and deceit. Some incorrupt bodies truly defied explanation. Found in cold, dry climates, sealed tombs, or soil rich in certain minerals, natural mummification sometimes occurred without intent. But medieval Europe did not understand chemistry. They understood signs. A body that refused to rot was a message from heaven, simple and undeniable. Science did not exist yet to explain it, so faith did what faith always does. It filled the silence with story. These stories spread through manuscripts and sermons, painted on walls and sung in hymns. A body that refused decay became a beacon for the living, proof that holiness could conquer even the laws of nature. One of the earliest and most famous cases was that of Saint Cecilia, patron saint of music. When her tomb was opened in Rome, centuries after her death, her body lay as if asleep. Her face was serene, her hands folded, her flesh intact. They said her skin still glowed faintly in the lamplight. An artist named Stefano Maderno was so moved by what he saw that he sculpted her exactly as she lay, not idealized, not divine, but human. Her statue still rests in the Basilica of Santa Cecilia, her body turned slightly to one side, her neck marked by the faint line of the blade that failed to kill her. Her incorrupt body became the first officially recognized miracle of the Church's modern age, and set the standard for all that followed. From that moment on, incorruptibility became not just a wonder, but an expectation. It wasn't just about the flesh, it was about what it meant. Incorrupt saints reminded people that death was not the end. They were visual theology, sermons made of skin. Each unrotting face said, God keeps his promises. Each still hand whispered, faith endures. But beneath the faith was fear. If holiness could preserve the body, what did corruption say about the soul? What if decay itself was a sign of damnation? This belief haunted even the righteous. Priests prayed for preservation. Nobles built stone coffins sealed against time. The poor wrapped their dead in salt and linen, hoping for a small miracle of their own. The Incorrupt became mirrors of both hope and horror. As centuries passed, the Church codified the phenomenon. Examinations were required before declaring sainthood. Witnesses were called. Doctors, early anatomists, were summoned to verify that no embalming or chemical preservation had occurred. Still, the results defied certainty. Some bodies remained supple for decades. Others hardened like wax. Some emitted floral scents, others none at all. In a few, blood was said to flow long after death. And so, between miracle and science, mystery remained. The faithful called it grace. The skeptics called it chance. The truth, as ever, slept between them, in catacombs lined with candles, beneath marble floors, behind glass where saints still stared with eyes unclouded by death. Even today, centuries later, those bodies remain. In Poland, Italy, France, Spain, faces still serene, hands still folded, flesh still pale and soft beneath silk. Some are displayed in cathedrals, others hidden from the public eye. Their preservation has survived revolutions, fires, wars. Science has offered explanations: the right temperature, humidity, natural oils, environmental luck. But for millions who stand before those glass coffins, none of that matters. Because faith does not ask how, it asks why. And in that why, the human heart finds something it cannot name: the longing to be remembered, to remain, to not disappear when the last breath fades. That longing is what kept pilgrims coming. That longing is what made saints eternal. The flesh that would not die became more than miracle. It became the final rebellion against oblivion. Every miracle begins with a question, and the Church, for all its faith, has always feared questions more than heresy. They called it incorruptio, the divine defiance of decay. But as the centuries passed, whispers began to twist through cloisters and courts alike. Was it truly heaven's hand that preserved the flesh, or merely nature working in silence? This was not blasphemy at first. It was curiosity. And curiosity in medieval Europe was the most dangerous form of faith. By the 14th century, the cult of incorrupt saints had become a cornerstone of devotion. From Rome to Krakow, cathedrals proudly displayed their preserved dead as living proof of God's mercy. Pilgrims kissed the glass, priests recited miracles, and the Church recorded every case in exquisite detail: the color of the skin, the scent of the air, the exact number of years since burial. But the more miracles they catalogued, the more inconsistencies appeared. Some bodies lasted decades, others only months. Some emitted a scent of lilies, others of frankincense. Some remained soft and pliant, others hardened into waxen stillness. And a troubling few began to crumble after years of veneration, their supposed eternity reduced to dust. To question one miracle was to threaten all, yet silence was no longer possible. Whispers spread among scholars. Could the incorruptible be natural? Could the miracle be accidental? In the monasteries, monks debated quietly over manuscripts. If incorruptibility was a sign of holiness, why did some sinners remain intact while saints decayed? And what of the bodies found preserved in desert caves or frozen mountains? Pagans, heathens, and warriors who knew nothing of Christ. Were they too favored by God? Theologians answered carefully. God may preserve what he wills, they said. But doubt, once spoken, has a way of multiplying like shadow. In 1599, a strange discovery deepened the riddle: the Capuchin catacombs of Palermo. There, friars uncovered hundreds of perfectly preserved bodies, not saints, not martyrs, but ordinary people.
farmers, children, merchants. Their faces dried but intact, their clothes still bright. The air was cool and dry, ideal for mummification. Though the friars did not know the word, to them it was a mass miracle. But how could hundreds be chosen by heaven? Word reached Rome. The Vatican sent observers. Their report was cautious, written in the language of faith wrapped around the uncertainty of science. In this climate, the hand of God works through the air itself. It was the first time the Church admitted, even in whispers, that perhaps not every miracle was divine.
For centuries, the Incorrupt had been tools of belief and of power. A saint's unrotting flesh could legitimize a church, sanctify a city, or strengthen a ruler's claim to divine favor. To own a holy corpse was to own a piece of eternity. When the body of Saint Catherine of Bologna was found unspoiled in 1463, the local bishop declared her a living symbol of the city's purity. Her body was placed upright on a throne, dressed in a nun's habit, her face still visible beneath a thin veil. Visitors called her La Santa Seduta, the sitting saint. Pilgrims came in droves, not just for faith, but for prestige. The city flourished. But in nearby Florence, jealousy brewed. Their saints had decayed, and their coffers had emptied. And so, quietly, rumors began. Perhaps Bologna's miracle was not divine, they whispered. Perhaps it was assisted. Such accusations were never made openly. To accuse a rival church of falsifying miracles was to risk excommunication. But beneath the surface, faith had become competition. Even holiness, it seemed, could be marketed. By the 17th century, the world was changing. The Renaissance had taught men to look closer, to measure, to doubt. Anatomy was now an art. Dissection had replaced superstition, or at least tried to. And with this new vision came an unsettling realization. Some bodies simply resisted decay for reasons that had nothing to do with God. The air, the temperature, the minerals in the soil, each played a role. Oil and resin used in burial rites, too, could preserve flesh. Even the tightness of a coffin, the dryness of a tomb, or the lack of oxygen could slow the dance of rot. Theologians called it a secondary miracle, nature working under divine instruction. Scientists called it environmental coincidence. But between them lay a chasm wide enough to swallow both faith and fact. In one Vatican archive, a 17th century scribe dared to note beside an incorrupt body's record, "No sign of decay, yet embalmed with herbs of Egypt." The annotation was later scratched out.
For the Church, miracles were not meant to be explained, they were meant to be believed. To pull away the veil was to risk destroying the faith that had sustained millions. And yet, even within the Vatican, the desire to understand grew stronger. In 1735, a Jesuit scholar named Giuseppe Lanzoni secretly examined several incorrupt bodies. He found traces of myrrh, salt, and resin, ancient embalming materials. He wrote his findings in a letter to Rome, concluding that preservation does not equal sanctity. The letter vanished. Lanzoni was reassigned to a remote monastery. His work was never published, but his question survived him. If holiness did not cause incorruption, could corruption still be holy? One of the strangest claims surrounding incorrupt saints was the odor of sanctity, the belief that holy bodies emitted a floral fragrance after death. Chroniclers described the tombs of saints filled with scents of jasmine, rose, and frankincense. In reality, Many bodies were buried with spices, perfumes, and incense, traditional rituals of reverence that masked decay. Yet to the faithful, the scent was proof of purity. When the tomb of Saint Teresa of Avila was opened, the air was said to fill with a perfume sweeter than any earthly flower. No one questioned whether the convent's perfumed oils had seeped into her shroud. The faithful did not need cause. They needed comfort. The scent was not just fragrance, it was theology made breathable. To smell holiness was to inhale eternity. The debate reached its quiet climax in the Enlightenment. While philosophers mocked the superstition of miracles, the people still knelt before incorrupt saints with unbroken devotion. Reason could not replace reverence. The Church learned to adapt, to frame the unrotting, not as proof, but as mystery. They no longer declared every uncorrupted body divine. Instead, they called them signs of grace unverified. Official canonization required evidence of virtue, miracles in life, and holiness in death, not just preservation. But still, behind closed doors, bishops debated. Did God touch these bodies? Or did the earth, in her silent chemistry, simply decide to spare them? No decree ever settled the matter.
By the 1800s, Europe's fascination with relics reached fever pitch. Collectors, nobles, and even priests scoured catacombs for bodies that might be declared saints. Entire markets sprang up. Bones, skulls, and preserved corpses traded like gold. Some were real martyrs, others were labeled with forged names and holy titles. In Munich, one priest confessed to purchasing a saint's body from a traveling merchant who claimed it was found in the catacombs of Rome. Years later, scientists discovered the skeleton belonged to a Roman child, naturally preserved by minerals in the soil. But by then, faith had already made him sacred. The people didn't care if the bones were ancient or modern. They cared that they believed. Behind the Vatican's marble corridors, deep below the archives, there is said to exist a chamber few ever see, the Conservatio Sancta. Within it, the preserved remains of saints are kept away from public view, examined, catalogued, and sometimes quietly debunked. Those that decay are removed from display. Those that remain whole are studied in silence. For even the Church now knows that miracles fade when exposed too long to air. Modern Vatican officials rarely speak of the incorruptible. Officially, they are objects of devotion, not evidence of divine suspension of nature. Unofficially, they remain what they always were, mysteries, best left unexplained. Because to explain them fully is to risk stripping the last veil from faith itself. So was it miracle or myth? Science says preservation. Faith says grace. History, as usual, says both and neither. Perhaps the miracle was never in the flesh, but in the eyes that saw it. Perhaps incorruptibility was not proof of holiness, but of humanity's refusal to let death win. The body became the symbol, but the belief was the real preservation. The saints refused to rot, yes, but maybe what truly refused to decay was our need to believe that something, anything, can last beyond the grave. And in that need, in that fragile defiance of oblivion, lies the truest incorruptibility of all.
The air should have smelled of rot, but it didn't. It smelled beautiful. That's what the witnesses said. When the tomb was opened, when the air should have turned foul, instead it filled with sweetness. Roses, they claimed,
though others swore it was lilies or honey, or something they couldn't name at all. No one expected that scent. And yet across the centuries, it came again and again, the odor of sanctity, the invisible signature of incorrupt saints. It was said to be heaven made fragrant, the breath of the divine caught in mortal air, a miracle not of sight, but of smell. The Church recorded it carefully, reverently, and at times nervously. For scent, unlike sight, cannot be proven. It can only be believed. In the medieval imagination, smell was more than sensation. It was morality. Goodness smelled sweet. Sin stank. Heaven was perfumed. Hell was putrid. The soul itself was thought to exhale its purity through fragrance. To live a virtuous life was to smell of sanctity, literally. In sermons, priests told their flocks that saints exuded sweetness even in death, because their bodies had been purified by divine grace. The wicked, on the other hand, were said to rot faster, to reek of sulfur and sin. The body was a vessel for morality, and decay was its confession. So when a corpse failed to stink, when it smelled impossibly of flowers, it wasn't just surprising. It was salvation's perfume. The chronicles tell of many. Saint Teresa of Avila, whose tomb was opened 9 months after burial, still smelled of roses and sandalwood. Saint Rita of Cassia, whose body never decayed, filled her chapel with the scent of violets centuries after death. Saint Catherine of Siena, they said, carried the fragrance of lilies even while alive, as though heaven was already claiming her piece by piece. One bishop described opening the coffin of Saint Francis Xavier Cabrini. The air rushed out like spring. A sweetness filled the room that made strong men weep. It was not just the bodies. It was the rooms, the walls, the very air. People believed the scent could cling to cloth, to prayer books, to the faithful themselves. And so, pilgrims came not only to see the incorrupt, but to breathe them. They leaned over coffins, pressing faces close to glass, inhaling deeply, searching for proof that holiness could still perfume the living world. Of course, not all were convinced. To some, the odor of sanctity was simply chemistry, the result of herbs, oils, and balms used during burial. In medieval convents, it was common to wash bodies with myrrh and rosewater before interment. Others were buried in cedar-lined coffins or wrapped in linen soaked with resins and spices, ancient methods borrowed from the East, where preservation had long been a sacred art. When such tombs were opened centuries later, the faint perfume of those ancient oils could still linger. To a devout witness, that was not explanation, it was evidence. Faith rarely asks how, it asks why. And if heaven chose to work through herbs and air, that only made the miracle more wondrous. The odor of sanctity soon became one of the Church's unofficial tests of incorruptibility. When a candidate for sainthood was exhumed, bishops and witnesses recorded not only the body's condition, but the air itself. Was there fragrance? Was it sweet? Did it linger? If yes, the report would note it in the margins, often underlined. Odor of sanctity, strong and pleasant, witnesses unanimous. But there was danger too, because fragrance fades and memory bends. What one monk called heavenly perfume, another might dismiss as the lingering scent of incense or wax. The Church began to tread carefully.
By the 18th century, the Vatican's canonization manuals listed the odor of sanctity as a sign to be considered, though not sufficient on its own. Even miracles, it seemed, needed disclaimers.
Theologians debated, was smell truly divine or merely symbolic? Could holiness really be detected by the nose? St. Thomas Aquinas, centuries earlier, had written that the senses could perceive traces of the soul's virtue, that grace, being real, might manifest in the physical. But his words were philosophical, not procedural. And yet, his ideas became literal dogma, that to smell heaven was to glimpse it. The faithful embraced this doctrine with passion. They claimed to smell sanctity in living saints, too, in their clothes, in their breath, in their very presence. It became a way to prove devotion without words. To smell sweetness was to encounter the sacred, and to smell rot was to encounter sin. It was an age before science could test the air, but not before the heart could be persuaded by it. Throughout Europe, the crypts of incorrupt saints became places of pilgrimage not just for sight, but for scent. In the monastery of Cascia, nuns tended the tomb of Saint Rita. Each time the coffin was opened for inspection, the entire convent filled with fragrance. In Lisieux, the chapel of Saint Therese was said to release a perfume so strong it lingered in the stone for weeks. And in the remote town of Lucca, Italy, the incorrupt body of Saint Zita drew crowds that brought flowers to match her scent: roses, hyacinths, and lavender. Some pilgrims even collected the air itself. They would hold linen cloths over the coffin, letting them absorb the invisible perfume, then take them home as relics. The church eventually forbade this. Too many counterfeits, too many merchants selling blessed cloths steeped in ordinary oil. But the idea endured, that the divine could not only be seen or heard, but inhaled. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the odor of sanctity became one of the Church's most criticized claims. Philosophers scoffed. If holiness has a smell, Voltaire wrote, then sainthood is merely a perfume. Anatomists argued that gases released during slow decay could sometimes mimic sweet scents, faintly floral, faintly deceptive. But the faithful answered with one word: consistency. For centuries, the scents never changed. Bodies that had lain untouched for hundreds of years still exhaled sweetness, never the acrid stench of time. How could corruption smell pure? Science had no answer that satisfied the soul. In truth, scent and sanctity had always been intertwined long before Christianity. Ancient Egyptians buried their dead with frankincense and myrrh, symbols of immortality. Romans burned perfumes at funerals, believing fragrance guided the soul upward. Even in pagan Europe, the smell of flowers at a grave meant the spirit lingered nearby. The Church, knowingly or not, inherited these rituals and gave them divine narrative. The holy aroma was continuity disguised as miracle. And yet, for all the rational explanations, one mystery remained. Why did the scent appear spontaneously? Not at burial, but centuries later when coffins were opened and air returned to the dead. In some cases, the fragrance was strongest just as the tomb was unsealed, as if the saint had waited for witnesses. Coincidence, perhaps? Or something else? Something the mind couldn't measure, but the heart couldn't deny. For believers, the holy aroma was not only a sign, it was a message. When St. Bernadette's tomb was opened in 1909,
The nuns reported the same scent that had filled her cell during her lifetime: fresh-cut roses. They wept, not because they doubted, but because they recognized her. The scent was her voice, her memory, her proof. To them, the perfume was not mystery, it was identity. The incorrupt dead, in their silence, still found a way to speak. Theologians began to call it the olfactory miracle, the fifth sense of faith. And even today, when her body lies in a glass case in Nevers, France, pilgrims still say the air around her smells faintly sweet. No incense burns there, no roses are kept near. Only the quiet and the scent that refuses to leave.
Modern science has studied such cases. Chemists have analyzed air samples, fabrics, even microscopic particles from the tombs of saints. No consistent compounds have been found. Some scents are natural oils, some are resins, some are unidentifiable. But faith never needed formulae. To a believer, the fragrance itself is the formula. It does not come from the body, but through it, as though the soul leaves behind a breath as it passes heavenward. The incorrupt body is the vessel. The holy aroma is the whisper it leaves behind. In time, the odor of sanctity became more than evidence. It became art. Painters surrounded saints with roses, gold light, and lilies. Poets wrote of bodies blooming in death, of coffins turned into gardens. And in the quiet of churches, where the air was thick with wax and prayer, believers still claimed to catch a hint of sweetness, faint, fleeting, yet enough to make them close their eyes and believe. Because what is faith, if not the courage to smell beauty in the midst of decay? Even now the phenomenon persists. In remote chapels, old catacombs, and quiet crypts, people still report the sudden appearance of unearthly perfume, roses where none grow, incense when none burns. Scientists call it suggestion, priests call it grace, but to those who have smelled it, the name hardly matters. Perhaps heaven, impatient with silence, learned to speak in scent. And perhaps in that fleeting sweetness lies the truest miracle of all, that even in death, something of us can still make the world a little more beautiful. She sang as the blade fell, and even in death the music did not stop. Her name was Cecilia, patron saint of music, martyr of Rome, and perhaps the most beautiful corpse the church had ever seen. For centuries, her story has drifted between miracle and myth, half history, half hymn. They say her body never decayed. They say her flesh was soft as the day she died. They say even now you can still hear her silence, and somehow it sings.
Cecilia lived in the 3rd century, in the heart of imperial Rome, a city of marble temples and burning altars, where the gods had many faces, but none offered mercy. She was born into privilege, a Roman noblewoman with dark eyes and a voice said to charm the very air. Her family worshipped the old gods, Jupiter, Venus, Mars, but Cecilia's heart belonged elsewhere. She had taken a vow of chastity, secretly consecrated herself to Christ, though the empire still hunted his followers. On her wedding day, when the musicians played, she whispered a different song beneath her breath, a hymn to the God she loved. "Let my heart remain pure," she prayed, "for only to him do I belong." That night, when her husband Valerian came to her, she confessed her secret. "I am guarded by an angel," she told him. "If you touch me with desire, he will strike you down." Valerian, astonished, demanded proof. So she told him to visit the catacombs beyond the city, where the persecuted Christians prayed among the dead,
and there he would see the truth. He went, and when he returned, his eyes were full of tears. He had seen the angel. From that night on, both Cecilia and Valerian devoted their lives to the forbidden faith. But Rome was not merciful. When the Roman prefect learned that Cecilia had converted nobles and servants alike, he ordered her execution. But killing a saint, it seems, is never simple. First, they locked her in the steam room of her own bathhouse, sealing every vent, filling it with boiling vapor. They waited for her screams. They never came. When they opened the doors the next morning, Cecilia stood alive, her skin unburned, her eyes calm. The guards fled in terror. The prefect ordered her beheaded. 3 blows fell, and still she did not die. For 3 days she lay bleeding on the marble floor, her head half severed, whispering prayers for those who watched her suffer. And in those final hours, they say, the air filled with a sound like music, faint, celestial, unlike anything human hands could make. When she finally died, her body was washed and placed in a simple wooden coffin, buried in the catacombs of St. Calixtus among the martyrs of Rome. For centuries she slept, silent, unseen, forgotten by all but faith, until they opened her tomb.
It was the year 1599, more than 1,300 years after Cecilia's death. The church was preparing to rebuild her basilica in Trastevere, and as part of the renovation, her ancient tomb was to be inspected. When the masons broke through the marble, they found a smaller sarcophagus inside, sealed with wax and iron. Bishops gathered, candles were lit. The air was heavy with incense and fear. The seal was broken, the lid lifted, and there she was. Not a skeleton, not dust, but a body, whole, uncorrupted, perfectly preserved. Her face turned to the side, her hands folded near her chest, the wound on her neck visible but dry and clean, her skin pale as ivory, her robes intact. The witnesses fell to their knees. Some wept openly, others simply stared, unable to speak. The scent of roses filled the chamber, the odor of sanctity. Cardinal Sfondrati, who presided over the discovery, called it a miracle of flesh untouched by time. He ordered that no one move the body, no one disturb the pose. Let her rest, he said, for even in death she prays. Among the witnesses was a young sculptor named Stefano Maderno. He had been commissioned to create a memorial for the saint's tomb, a statue that would show her exactly as she had been found. Maderno was not a man of miracles. He was an artist, a realist. But what he saw that day changed him forever. He sketched quickly, his hands trembling, desperate to capture the perfection of the moment. When he finished his marble masterpiece, it looked less like sculpture than revelation. Cecilia lies on her right side, her face turned away, her body curled as though in gentle sleep. Her neck bears 3 faint cuts, the marks of her martyrdom. Her hands, crossed in front of her, hold 3 fingers extended, one for each blow and one for the Trinity. The statue was unveiled beneath the altar of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, and to this day, visitors still whisper that she looks alive, as if she might wake at any moment.
No other incorrupt saint has ever inspired such a paradox. Cecilia is not displayed in glass, not posed like a relic, not painted in gold. She lies hidden beneath marble, silent and faceless. Yet
She is the patron of sound. Her silence is her song. The Church declared her incorruption a miracle. Scientists centuries later would suggest that her preservation was due to the cool, dry catacomb air, perhaps aided by the wax and linen of her burial shroud. But those who stand before her tomb feel something that science cannot name. They say the silence hums. It's not sound, not music, more like the memory of a song still vibrating in the stone. As the story of Cecilia spread, musicians began to adopt her as their protector. Composers wrote hymns in her honor. Choirs sang her name before performances. Churches dedicated to her sprang up across Europe, filled with organs and choirs, and the promise that music could reach heaven faster than prayer. But beneath all the celebration lay something deeper, something darker. For Cecilia's gift was not that she sang, it was that she kept singing when her throat was cut. Her faith turned agony into art. In this, she became the embodiment of incorruptibility, not of flesh, but of devotion. Her body defied decay. Her music defied silence. And both became proof that the spirit could endure even after the body failed. In medieval theology, music was considered divine mathematics, the harmony of creation itself. To the faithful, every saint was a note in God's eternal composition. But Cecilia was more than that. She was the instrument, fragile, human, and yet capable of carrying the voice of heaven. Her incorrupt body became the symbol of that perfect harmony between flesh and soul. To gaze upon her was to be reminded that faith could turn even death into melody. Her statue in Trastevere became a pilgrimage site, not only for believers, but for artists, poets, and composers who sought to touch something eternal. Handel wrote Ode for St. Cecilia's Day. Purcell composed Hail, Bright Cecilia. Even in the age of reason, her silence continued to inspire sound. The paradox lived on. The saint who never spoke had given voice to centuries.
In the years that followed her rediscovery, the Church performed several quiet examinations of Cecilia's tomb. Each time, the reports were cautious. The body, they said, was still intact, though darker, hardened by the air. The linen shroud had yellowed, the flowers had withered, but the form remained. No further openings were permitted. The Vatican sealed the records, declaring her preservation confirmed and complete. Her incorruption was now canonized truth. Still, whispers persisted. Some suggested her body had been treated with oils. Others claimed the account exaggerated her condition, but no one dared challenge the Church's official stance. To question Cecilia was to question beauty itself, and beauty, in the age of faith, was sacred. To this day, St. Cecilia's feast is celebrated every November 22nd. Choruses fill cathedrals with her hymns. Organs thunder her praises. Her name is invoked before performances, her face painted beside angelic harps and violins. But beneath all the music lies a tomb in silence. Beneath all the hymns lies a body that has not sung in 17 centuries. Her miracle is not that she defied death. It's that death still listens. The Basilica of Santa Cecilia stands on the edge of Trastevere, surrounded by narrow streets and fading frescoes. When you step inside, the noise of the city fades. The air grows still. And if you stand long enough before her marble figure, you begin to hear it,
not with your ears, but with something older, something that remembers the echo of faith before language, the sound of silence. Cecilia's story taught the Church a powerful truth, that the incorruptible body was not merely a relic, it was a metaphor. Her flesh preserved, her music eternal. Together they formed the perfect harmony between body and soul, art and devotion, death and life. Every saint after her would follow that pattern. The unrotting body was no longer just a miracle, it was a symbol. And in that symbol, faith found its favorite instrument, the human form itself. Cecilia had become what the Church always wanted its saints to be: beautiful in death, obedient in silence, eternal in message. Her body did not decay, but her meaning evolved. She was no longer just a martyr. She was a melody frozen in time.
There's a legend whispered among the caretakers of the basilica. They say that at night, when the church is empty and the candles burn low, you can hear a single note, faint, pure, rising from beneath the altar. No one knows if it's the wind or something older, but they call it Cecilia's breath, the sound of a prayer that never stopped. Perhaps it's just imagination, or perhaps, even now, the saint who sang as the blade fell still hums in the silence of stone. For some miracles never end, they only change their rhythm. Every cathedral has two faces, one for heaven and one for the dead. Walk into any medieval cathedral and look up. You'll see heaven, arches like angel wings, glass glowing with the colors of salvation, stone carved into the shape of eternity. But if you look down, beneath the marble, beneath the echoing footsteps of prayer, there lies another world, one the faithful rarely speak of, a world of crypts, a world of silence, a world where saints, kings, and sinners sleep together in the cold breath of stone. In the Middle Ages, the earth beneath the cathedral was sacred ground, the final resting place of those closest to God. Every bishop, every martyr, every holy relic was buried there in the cool, dark vaults that mirrored the heavens above. The architecture itself was symbolic. The church was the body of Christ, its nave the ribs, its altar the heart, its crypt the womb of resurrection. To be buried beneath it was to be reborn in its shadow. Pilgrims prayed above, unaware that below them bodies lay stacked in carved niches, wrapped in linen, sealed in coffins, sometimes seated upright in prayer. Candles flickered against walls of bone. Water dripped through cracks in the stone. And somewhere, in that damp and quiet dark, faith found its most tangible expression, the incorrupt dead. The crypts were not accidents. They were design. Cathedrals were built on layers of belief, literally. Beneath Notre Dame in Paris, beneath Cologne, Chartres, and Canterbury, the earliest Christian shrines grew from Roman tombs. Martyrs had been buried there long before the cathedrals rose, and when churches were built above, their bones became foundations. The altar stood directly over the grave of a saint. Heaven above, flesh below. To medieval minds, this was perfect symmetry. Every Mass was celebrated on a tomb. Every prayer rose through layers of death toward the divine. But the saints below did more than bless the space. They drew the crowds.
Incorrupt saints were the heart of pilgrimage. Their bodies turned remote towns into centers of faith and wealth. A single unrotting corpse could transform a church into a destination for thousands. The faithful came with offerings, coins, jewels, candles, vows whispered in the dark. Merchants followed, selling relics, wine, bread, and hope. And soon every bishop dreamed of discovering his own miracle beneath the floor.
When the incorrupt body of St. Cuthbert was uncovered at Durham, pilgrims flooded the city. When St. Zita's preserved form was displayed in Lucca, travelers walked from as far as France to kneel before her glass coffin. The Church did not discourage it. Faith, after all, needed places to gather, and miracles needed witnesses. But with every miracle came suspicion. The line between devotion and display grew thin. No city holds more bones than Rome. Beneath its churches lie layers of the dead, ancient martyrs, popes, monks, and nameless believers sleeping side by side in narrow corridors carved from tufa stone. The catacombs of St. Calixtus stretch for miles, lined with frescoes of doves, fish, and crossed anchors, symbols of a faith that survived underground. Here, in the flicker of oil lamps, the first Christians buried their dead with hymns instead of cries. Bodies were laid in niches carved into the walls, sealed with clay and marked with simple inscriptions, "In pace, she sleeps in Christ." When persecutions ended, the catacombs were abandoned. Centuries later, when they were rediscovered, the air still smelled faintly of wax and myrrh. Some bodies, perfectly preserved by the dry stone, looked as though they had merely fallen asleep. The Church declared them blessed relics. Incorrupt by grace or by geology, it mattered little. Their discovery confirmed what the faithful already believed, that beneath the earth, heaven was not far away. By the 13th century, Europe's cathedrals had become reliquaries, great stone vaults built to contain fragments of holiness. Every city wanted its saint. Every altar needed its relic. The incorrupt became priceless. Some crypts were opened not for prayer, but for verification. Bodies were exhumed, inspected, and declared miraculous. Others were quietly replaced when time did its work. Decayed remains swapped for better preserved ones from anonymous tombs. In the chaos of crusades and plague, the trade grew fierce. The bones of martyrs were smuggled across borders, stolen, sold, or forged. Churches fought legal battles over ownership. Popes issued edicts to control the flood, but faith, once mixed with profit, was hard to contain. Beneath the cathedrals, miracles and money shared the same air.
Those who tended the crypts, the monks, the keepers, the candle watchers, spoke of the dead as if they were alive. They whispered greetings to the saints at dawn. They apologized when sweeping dust near the coffins. They believed the incorrupt could hear them, that the silence of stone was not the end of conversation, only the beginning. They described strange happenings, soft music in the corridors, a breath of perfume in the dark, a candle that burned without air. Whether these were miracles or the tricks of solitude, no one dared say. In the stillness, belief filled every gap. To care for the incorrupt was a sacred duty, and a dangerous one. There were stories of monks who went mad from too long in the catacombs, claiming the saints whispered to them from their coffins. Others reported dreams of the dead asking to be moved, uncovered, or left alone. Faith, in the dark, has a voice of its own. Above ground, cathedrals lived in sound, choirs, bells, and the murmured sea of prayer. Below, they lived in silence, the slow exhale of centuries. In winter, the breath of the crypt rose through the floor like mist, carrying with it the scent of incense, wax, and something older. Visitors spoke of feeling watched, not by ghosts, but by grace itself. Architects designed it that way. Every cathedral was built to breathe, air shafts connecting the living and the dead, sanctity circulating through stone. It was theology in architecture, life and death, heaven and earth, sharing the same lungs. When pilgrims knelt at the altar, their voices passed down into the crypt below, mingling with the silence of the incorrupt. In that communion,
belief became tangible. Every so often, a cathedral's renovation unearthed what time had hidden. A coffin cracked open, a saint discovered, a legend reborn. In 1307, masons repairing the crypt beneath Saint-Denis in Paris found the body of Queen Dagmar, buried for 2 centuries, still dressed in silk, her face untouched. The discovery was called divine proof of royal virtue. In reality, the cool, airtight tomb had simply preserved her. But faith needed no science. In 1647, the monks of St. Ursula's Church in Cologne uncovered a mass grave beneath their chapel. Hundreds of skeletons, each adorned with gold and jewels. They claimed the remains belonged to the 11,000 virgins, companions of St. Ursula, martyred by the Huns. The relics were displayed across Europe. Later scholars proved they were ordinary medieval burials, their identities lost. But by then, the legend had taken root. The bones had become believers.
Not every crypt preserved. Some decayed in beauty. In Venice, beneath the church of San Zaccaria, groundwater rose and fell with the tides. Coffins floated, then sank again, the corpses within slowly embalmed by mineral-rich water. When they were finally retrieved, their faces were pale and smooth, their skin translucent like wax. The Venetians called it the blessing of the lagoon. Elsewhere, monks discovered that dryness was the better miracle. In Spain and Italy, crypts carved into limestone or volcanic rock naturally desiccated bodies, halting decay. The monks called it divine air. Scientists would later call it physics. But in those days, no one cared for definitions. They cared for wonder and the scent of eternity in the dust. To the faithful, the cathedrals above and the crypts below were not separate worlds. They were one continuous act of devotion. The saints underfoot were not dead, but waiting. The pilgrims above were not alone, but accompanied. Every step, every hymn, every candle was shared across that thin veil of stone. And in the quiet of the crypt, where wax dripped and time held its breath, the incorrupt saints lay like seeds, waiting for resurrection. They were not reminders of mortality. They were promises that death, too, could be beautiful. Even today, the crypts endure. Beneath Paris, beneath Rome, beneath countless forgotten churches, the dead still rest in ordered silence. Visitors come with flashlights instead of candles, cameras instead of rosaries, but the awe remains the same. Some leave trembling. Some leave laughing nervously. A few claim to have smelled that same ancient sweetness, the faint perfume of the incorrupt. Perhaps it's mold, perhaps incense, perhaps imagination. But when the air grows thick and time feels suspended, even skeptics whisper, it's colder down here than it should be. The cathedrals above have cracked, burned, and been rebuilt, but the world below, the world of the incorrupt, remains untouched, patient, eternal.
Stand in any great cathedral, in Seville, in Milan, in Notre Dame. Wait until the last Mass ends, until the candles gutter out, until the final echo of prayer fades. Then listen. Beneath your feet, the crypt breathes. A sigh through the stone, a heartbeat of centuries. Not the sound of ghosts, but of faith itself, still alive beneath the weight of the world. And somewhere in that breath, in that mingling of the living and the dead, lies the oldest truth of all. That heaven may be above the spires, but eternity lives beneath them.
For centuries, the incorrupt saints had been left undisturbed, sleeping beneath marble altars,
their bodies whispered about, but rarely touched. But as the world changed, as reason crept into the cracks of belief, the church realized something unsettling. It could not afford blind faith forever. Miracles drew crowds. Crowds brought money. But unverified miracles brought questions, and questions in Rome were dangerous things. And so quietly, carefully, the church began to investigate. It began in the late 1500s, the era of reform, of skepticism, of whispered heresies. Protestants mocked Catholic relics as superstition. Scientists dissected the human body in public halls, reducing flesh to logic. And Europe itself had grown tired of magic that couldn't explain itself. The Vatican needed to protect its saints. To defend the miraculous, it first had to measure it. Thus began a strange chapter in Christian history, the era of holy autopsies, when the Church of Faith became, briefly, a church of forensics. In monasteries across Europe, bells rang at midnight, not for prayer, but for excavation. Priests, bishops, and papal envoys gathered around tombs sealed for centuries. They lifted marble slabs, broke open coffins, and held torches over the faces of saints long dead. Each examination followed a ritual of reverence and of science. Clergy prayed, witnesses signed documents, physicians summoned under secrecy took notes in Latin. They were instructed to record everything: the color of the skin, the texture of the flesh, the presence or absence of odor, whether the body was flexible or rigid, whether the eyes had collapsed or still glistened. Even the condition of the garments was noted with precision. If all seemed miraculous, a papal seal was applied. If doubt lingered, the body was quietly reburied. The faithful never knew the difference.
By the 17th century, the Church had formalized the process. Canonization required proof, not just of virtue in life, but of incorruption in death. The Congregation of Rites, the Vatican body responsible for sainthood, created a document called De Servorum Dei Beatificatione et Beatorum Canonizatione, on the beatification of the servants of God. It became, in essence, the miracle manual. According to its rules, a body that resisted decay might be evidence of holiness. But if embalming, desiccation, or other natural causes were possible, it could not be counted as proof. Fragrance, flexibility, and softness of flesh were to be noted, but not trusted absolutely. The Church, in effect, had become its own skeptic. Yet it was a quiet skepticism, one that sought to preserve belief, not destroy it. The Vatican never denied the miraculous. It simply learned to curate it. One of the first recorded investigations occurred in Bologna in 1599, the same year St. Cecilia's tomb was opened. A team of clerics examined her body with both reverence and curiosity. They reported her flesh intact, her face serene, her posture lifelike. They also noted, discreetly, that her coffin had been sealed with wax, that her burial clothes were of tightly woven silk, and that the air of the catacomb was unusually dry. But these details, though written, were not spoken aloud. The official declaration read only, "Her body remains whole, incorrupt by time. Deo gratias." The Church, it seemed, would acknowledge the physical while declaring the spiritual. Science could observe, only faith could conclude. As investigations continued, inconsistencies grew impossible to ignore. Some incorrupt saints decayed after exposure.
Others, once thought preserved, were found mummified, leathery and rigid, not soft as legend claimed. Some released sweet fragrance, others nothing at all. And a few were discovered to have been embalmed, an art long practiced but rarely admitted. One such case was Saint Andrew Bobola, exiled in 1719. Witnesses claimed his body was intact despite decades in a damp grave. But later examination revealed traces of resin and salt, substances known to preserve tissue. Still, the Church declared it a miracle, but added a careful note. The divine sometimes works through natural means. It was the perfect compromise. Science explained the method. Faith explained the meaning.
By the 18th century, the Vatican archives were filled with reports of incorrupt bodies, some authenticated, others quietly set aside. Behind closed doors, clerics debated what made a miracle true. In a small chamber beneath St. Peter's, known informally as the Chamber of Veritas, relics were studied, away from the public eye. Fragments of bone, bits of skin, even entire mummified heads were stored there, each labeled with the name of a saint, or the name of doubt. The purpose was not disbelief, but discernment. Faith, the Church understood, must protect itself from the counterfeit. Within those walls, priests and physicians worked side by side, a strange alliance of scripture and scalpel. They measured temperature, humidity, and mineral content of soil samples. They recorded the strange chemistry of preservation. And though many found natural explanations, few dared to write them down. In the end, every report ended with the same phrase: "The cause of incorruption is known only to God." Outside Rome, not all investigations were so delicate. In 1731, in the town of Nevers, France, the body of Saint Bernadette was examined for canonization. Her body was nearly perfect, flexible, unblemished, with a faint scent of roses. Doctors, curious, removed a piece of skin and found it elastic, almost living. They preserved samples in wax and alcohol for study. A century later, when re-examined, the same body remained unchanged. Pilgrims called it divine. Scientists called it impossible. The Church called it mysterious. To this day, Bernadette lies in a glass coffin in Nevers, her face covered by a wax mask to prevent damage, her body still whole. And while her incorruptibility has never been officially declared a miracle, millions kneel before her in awe. Sometimes, silence is the only safe conclusion. Not everyone in the Church agreed with the investigations. Some cardinals argued that probing a miracle was a kind of sacrilege, that to seek proof was to confess doubt. Others feared scandal. What if the saints crumbled under scrutiny? One bishop wrote bitterly in a private letter, "The faithful do not come for the truth of decay. They come for the truth of comfort." But the world outside was changing faster than the Church could contain it. Empiricism was spreading. Science was no longer content to remain outside the cathedral walls. And the Vatican understood that the credibility of the miraculous depended not on belief alone, but on order, documentation, and restraint. So the investigations continued, quietly, methodically, beneath the veil of reverence.
For every incorrupt saint displayed to the public, there were others the Church chose to forget. Bodies that had decayed, that had discolored, that had failed the test of eternity. Those reports were sealed, marked non constat de miraculo. The miracle is not confirmed. No announcement, no outrage, just silence. Faith, like history, is curated by omission. And yet,
even with all their caution, the investigations never ended belief. Because every so often, one body truly defied all reason. No embalming, no preservation, no decay. And when that happened, even the skeptics prayed. In 1753, the body of Saint Veronica Giuliani was examined 50 years after death. It was found entire, fresh, and exuding fragrance. No embalming was recorded, no tomb condition could explain it. The Church approved her canonization. Her incorruptibility remains listed as scientifically unaccounted for. In 1925, the remains of Saint Sylvan were displayed in Dubrovnik. His face, visible beneath glass, appears untouched, his expression serene. Tests revealed no embalming chemicals, only natural mummification that somehow preserved even the eyelashes. His coffin rests in a small chapel, where visitors still whisper, "He smiles." Not every mystery can be managed. By the 19th century, with microscopes and chemistry rising, some priests invited scientists to study incorrupt bodies openly. Samples were taken from waxy skin, bones, and fabrics. Many were found to contain traces of sodium, calcium, and tannins, elements common in dry soils. Others showed microbial absence due to mineral-heavy air. These findings did not end the miracles. Instead, they refined them. The Church declared that incorruption is not the sole sign of holiness, but a possible reflection of grace. It was a subtle shift. The miracle became metaphor. And in that metaphor, faith survived the microscope.
Behind the sanctity, however, lay an unspoken anxiety. What if, one day, all incorruptibility could be explained? Would faith collapse under knowledge? Or would explanation itself become the next miracle? Proof that creation was even more intricate than belief had imagined. No answer ever came. Because the Church, wise in its age, learned something that science never could. The mystery was not in the body. It was in what the body made people feel. Today, Vatican investigations continue, though rarely spoken of. Bodies are still studied, though quietly, with gloved hands and whispered Latin. In archives marked confidentialis, thousands of reports sit unread, each describing a miracle, both physical and philosophical. The conclusions vary, but the tone never changes. There are things which remain incorrupt not for want of decay, but because they were never meant to decay at all. Perhaps the Church, after all its centuries of study, returned to where it began, to faith without proof, wonder without fear. Because maybe in the end, the greatest miracle isn't a body that refuses to rot. Maybe it's a belief that refuses to die. All flesh returns to dust. But what if dust itself remembers? For centuries, the Church had searched for holiness in bodies that refused to rot. But as science emerged from the shadows of faith, another idea began to take root, one far more heretical, and perhaps more honest, that even in decay there might be divinity. Because what if decomposition, that slow, secret undoing of the flesh, was not corruption at all? What if it was transformation? In medieval times, decay was a mystery wrapped in terror. No one understood why one body vanished quickly,
while another lingered intact. Some said it was the judgment of God, that sin caused the flesh to fester. Others whispered that the incorrupt were saints, spared the shame of rot. But alchemists saw something else. They saw process. To them, rot was not punishment. It was perfection. The body turning inward, breaking down to reveal what it had always been made of: earth, water, fire, and air. The four elements, reunited. The divine cycle, complete. In their laboratories, dim rooms filled with brass flasks, candlelight, and the bitter scent of sulfur, alchemists studied the dead as they would study metals. Decay, they said, was nature's philosopher's stone, the end of flesh and the beginning of transformation. Where priests saw miracles, alchemists saw equations.
Every body, they believed, held within it the potential for rebirth. The worms were not desecration, they were creation. The fluids of rot, the gases of decay, the softening of bone, all were part of a vast and sacred chemistry that mirrored the turning of the stars. "Nothing dies," one monk alchemist wrote. "It only changes costume." In monasteries that doubled as early laboratories, monks preserved corpses to observe their disintegration, recording the stages with unsettling precision. They described the bloom of the flesh, when skin turned green and split. They timed the collapse of eyes, the softening of bone, the final release of air from the lungs. They did this not out of morbid fascination, but out of reverence. To watch the body return to dust was to watch creation rewind. It was theology made visible, God in reverse. The soil, too, played its part in the great transformation. Every region, every burial ground was its own laboratory, each with a recipe for decay. In the humid graveyards of southern Italy, the dead turned to black paste within weeks. In the frozen crypts of the Alps, bodies mummified naturally, their skin tightening like parchment, their faces frozen in quiet surprise. In the deserts of Egypt, where air was dry enough to kill, the dead seemed immortal, leathered, golden, preserved by absence itself. The earth, it seemed, chose which bodies to claim and which to keep. Some it devoured, others it embalmed. And in this silent selection, faith found metaphor, that nature too knew the difference between the holy and the ordinary. But science, creeping closer, saw only chemistry. In Palermo, the Capuchin monks of the 16th century turned decay into devotion. When one of their brothers died, they placed his body in a special chamber, cool, dry, and lined with volcanic stone. After a few weeks, they returned to find the body perfectly mummified. No smell, no rot, only a serene stillness. They saw it not as preservation, but purification. They began to hang their dead in the catacombs, row upon row of monks in brown robes, their faces shrunken but peaceful, their hands clasped in eternal prayer. Over time, nobles begged to join them, paying for a place among the holy. When visitors descended centuries later, the sight was almost unbearable. A city of the dead, standing upright, their silence thick as incense. But to the monks, this was beauty. This was the alchemy of faith. Flesh transformed into symbol. Mortality turned to memory.
By the 18th century, naturalists and early chemists took up the study of decay not as heresy, but as science. They discovered what alchemists had guessed, that heat, moisture, and bacteria determined the pace of decomposition. That in dry, sealed spaces, flesh could last for centuries. that certain soils, rich in nitrates or salt, acted as natural preservatives, and that even the gases of the dead, once feared as miasma, could be measured, captured, understood. In other words, the miracle had rules. But for all their instruments, these scientists could not strip away the sense of mystery. Many wrote with reverence, even awe, describing decay as if it were art. One French anatomist called it the most faithful painter of time. In their notebooks, science and poetry merged, and the old language of faith found its way back into chemistry. They no longer called it corruption, they called it transformation. Yet for every explanation of decay, there remained its opposite, the body that refused to follow the rules. In tombs both ancient and new, the incorrupt continued to appear, untouched by time, sealed in perfection. Each new case reignited debate. Was this divine or simply the right conditions? In the 1800s, French physician Louis Gay-Lussac studied the bodies of the Paris catacombs. He concluded that preservation required a delicate balance, no air, no moisture, no movement. And yet, he admitted, some corpses remained soft even in unfavorable environments. He called it la science de l'impossible, the science of the impossible. The church smiled quietly at that phrase, because it was what they had always believed. Somewhere along the centuries, the idea of incorruption began to change. No longer just about the flesh, it became about what survived inside it. If decay was transformation, then incorruptibility was not merely the absence of rot, it was the perfection of that transformation. The saint did not resist decay because they denied nature, they transcended it. Just as metals refined into gold through fire, the saint's body became a vessel purified through faith. In alchemical symbolism, gold was the metal of the incorruptible. It never rusted, never tarnished. So too the saints became God's gold, the purest matter, immune to corruption. This was not science, it was poetry in flesh.
In monasteries and laboratories alike, men began to see the body as a kind of text, written by God, edited by decay. Each wrinkle, each collapse of tissue, each bloom of mold was a word in that divine book. To study it was not to desecrate it, but to read it. And to preserve it was to pause the sentence before the period. The incorrupt saints, then, were punctuation marks in eternity, commas in the long sentence of creation, pauses between worlds. Their flesh, still soft, whispered that even endings could be graceful. By the 19th century, embalming had become an art, a human imitation of divine incorruption. Doctors and undertakers used arsenic, mercury, and later formaldehyde to preserve bodies for decades. Kings and presidents began to look like saints, soft, lifelike, unrotting beneath glass. But the more humanity learned to preserve itself, the less miraculous incorruption became. And so the Church, in its wisdom, retreated from the claim. It no longer declared the unrotting body proof of holiness. It declared it a sign of grace, open to mystery, but not necessary for faith. In a way, this was the ultimate alchemy, the transformation of miracle into metaphor. Because science had proven what faith had always known, that the boundary between life and death is not fixed. It breathes, it changes shape, it lingers. Today, scientists can explain almost every stage of decay, from bacterial bloom to skeletal dust. But there are still bodies that defy all logic. Found in peat bogs, deserts, sealed tombs, and church vaults, they rest halfway between death and eternity. Soft, scented, uncorrupted. Tests reveal no embalming, no trick, no reason. And so even in the age of forensics,
the Church's phrase remains the most accurate of all. The cause is known only to God. Maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe incorruptibility and decay are not opposites at all, but partners in the same divine chemistry, because both lead back to the same dust, and both, in their own way, preserve the soul.
In the old alchemical texts, the last stage of transformation was called rubedo, the reddening, when base matter finally achieved perfection. It was the moment when death itself turned to gold. Perhaps that is what the incorrupt saints represent, the body's final refinement, not by fire, but by faith. The moment when decay hesitates, when the earth itself pauses to honor what it holds. The alchemists never found the philosopher's stone, but maybe the saints did. Maybe it was never a mineral, but a mystery. Not something to hold, but something to become. Stand before any tomb, the saints or the sinners, the marble or the humble, and you'll see the same story written in silence. Nothing truly ends. Every scent, every particle, every grain of dust continues its quiet pilgrimage. The same atoms that once made a saint may now drift through air, feed roots, or shimmer in light. The incorrupt lies still, untouched. The rest return to soil, to stone, to stars. Both are miracles. And if decay is just the earth remembering us, then maybe, just maybe, every grave is a kind of resurrection. She lay there as if dreaming, her lips parted, her skin unbroken, her hands folded in a prayer that time refused to interrupt. It began, as so many miracles do, with disbelief. A nun, dead for years, discovered untouched by decay. Her face still serene, her body warm to the touch, and the people trembling at her feet, whispering, "She sleeps." Her name was Sister Maria de Jesus Lopez, but to the world she became La Moña Dormida, the Sleeping Nun of Cádiz. It was the year 1632, in the quiet coastal city of Cádiz, Spain, a place of salt and prayer, where convent bells echoed through narrow streets and the scent of the sea mingled with incense. Sister Maria was 33 when she fell ill, a fever that lasted 3 days and ended in silence. Her sisters washed her body, wrapped it in linen, and placed her in a wooden coffin beneath the chapel floor. The bells tolled, the prayers were spoken, and life in the convent went on. Decades passed. The world changed. Empires rose and faltered, and beneath the marble of that small church, Maria lay waiting.
A century later, renovations began in the convent of Santa Catalina. The workers, digging near the old foundation, struck something hard, the corner of a coffin. Inside, they expected bones. What they found instead stopped them cold. A body, whole, the skin soft, the cheeks pale, the lips faintly red as if painted by breath. The linen was yellowed but intact. There was no odor, no sign of rot. When word reached the Mother Superior, she fainted. The sisters gathered by candlelight, opening the coffin only enough to see her face. They wept, prayed, and dared not speak of what they saw. But silence has never been the Church's strongest virtue. By dawn, the streets of Cádiz knew the story. A nun who does not die.
Witnesses swore the air around her smelled of jasmine and salt. Some said the scent grew stronger the closer you knelt to her. One bishop described it as the perfume of obedience. Others claimed to hear faint whispers when they prayed beside her. Not words, but something softer, like sighs. Within days, the convent became a pilgrimage site. Fishermen came before sailing, asking her to bless their nets. Sailors touched her coffin for safe passage across the Atlantic. The faithful left offerings, pearls, rosaries, locks of hair. And always they called her the Sleeping Nun, because even in death she seemed merely at rest, waiting for a dream to end. When news reached Seville, the archbishop ordered an investigation. Such discoveries were not rare in Spain. The 17th century had been fertile ground for incorrupt saints, but each case risked scandal if proven false. A team of priests, physicians, and notaries arrived in Cádiz. They opened the tomb again under oath and light. Every detail was recorded. They found the body flexible, unblemished, with eyes closed and mouth relaxed. Her hair was still dark. Her habit, though old, showed no decay. When pressed, her skin yielded like living flesh. They noted something else, too. The temperature of the body was not cold. It was neutral, neither living nor dead. One doctor wrote, "It is not warmth, but it is not the death's chill either. It is as though her body remains undecided."
For the Church, incorruptibility was a gift, but also a risk. True miracles inspired devotion. False ones bred heresy, or worse, mockery. The line between wonder and fraud was perilously thin. So the investigators approached Maria's case with both reverence and suspicion. They examined the soil, dry but not desiccating. They tested the coffin wood. No resin, no sealant. They found no trace of embalming oils or herbs, and still, she remained untouched. The archbishop declared it worthy of veneration pending further discernment. The Vatican, however, hesitated. Spain, after all, had a reputation for enthusiasm. So the body remained in Cádiz, neither saint nor sinner, simply sleeping. For the people of Cádiz, investigation meant little. They had already made up their minds. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, the convent opened the chapel to pilgrims. The coffin, draped in lace and glass, was brought before the altar. Candles lined the walls, their light shimmering against her face. Children whispered that she blinked. Old women claimed her lips moved in prayer. And sailors, before long voyages, would visit to ask her for calm seas, believing she could speak to the waves from her unbroken sleep. The faithful began to call her Nuestra Señora del Silencio, Our Lady of Silence, not because she spoke little, but because she had said everything simply by not decaying. Not all were convinced. A few scholars suggested that Cádiz's dry, salty air had created a natural mummification effect, that the same winds that preserved fish in the market could, by accident, preserve a human body. Others accused the convent of tampering, of secretly anointing the corpse with oils to preserve the miracle. The nuns denied it vehemently. Yet, in 1765, when the new bishop ordered a second inspection, something unexpected happened. The coffin was opened again, and her body was still whole, but changed. Her skin had hardened slightly, her features sharpened. The faint blush on her lips had faded. She was no longer the sleeping girl, but neither was she dust. It was as though death, patient and polite, had resumed its work, very slowly. The Church took this as a sign of natural process. The faithful took it as proof that even miracles, like dreams, must one day end.
In the decades that followed, Cádiz endured earthquakes, fires, and war. The convent was damaged but never destroyed, and through every disaster, the coffin remained untouched. When Napoleon's troops invaded Spain, they looted churches across the south, burning relics and desecrating tombs. But in Santa Catalina, something strange happened. According to the surviving sisters, the soldiers entered the chapel and then fled. They claimed they had seen the nun's eyes open. No official record confirms this, of course, but it was enough to make the people of Cádiz believe that she protected the city itself. After the war, when the convent was rebuilt, her coffin was placed beneath the main altar, a silent guardian of the faithful. By the late 19th century, the church revisited Maria's case one last time. Modern doctors were invited to examine the body, this time with instruments of science. They noted desiccation, but no decomposition. Her organs had collapsed but remained intact. Her skin, though darkened, was still soft in places. No embalming fluid was detected. One physician wrote, "If this is nature, it is a patient one. She decays slower than the calendar itself." The Vatican archived the findings quietly, labeling her condition as inexplicable natural preservation. No canonization followed. No miracles were officially declared. But the people continued to come, and for them, science was simply another kind of reverence. Today she rests in a glass case beneath the convent's altar, her habit faded, her face calm. Tourists and pilgrims visit her daily. Some take photos, others cross themselves, whispering prayers for peace or for time to be kind. The nuns still call her La Dormida. They clean the glass every morning, light candles, and recite a single psalm beside her coffin. He gives his beloved sleep. And when the wind from the sea passes through the chapel, it smells faintly of salt and flowers. Always. The sleeping nun's story lives somewhere between miracle and metaphor. Science can explain her preservation, dryness, minerals, still air. Faith can explain it differently, purity, grace, divine pause. Neither cancels the other, because perhaps the point was never to prove why she didn't decay. Perhaps the point was to remind the living how to rest, how to surrender to stillness without fear. Maria's incorrupt body, untouched for nearly 4 centuries, is not a defiance of death. It's a collaboration with it, a peaceful truce between flesh and forever. In her silence, there is a kind of mercy, that not every story ends with rot, and not every death must rush to completion. At night, when the convent is empty and the candles burn low, the sisters say the air shifts. The scent of jasmine grows stronger. The shadows seem to bend toward the coffin. They do not fear it. They whisper good night to her, as if she were simply another sister, asleep, listening, waiting. And perhaps she is. Perhaps somewhere between heartbeat and heaven, she still dreams of the sea. For after all, she was never called the dead nun of Cádiz, only the sleeping one. In Venice, even death must learn to pose. It sits there still, behind glass, under gold, in a church that smells of salt and candle smoke. The pilgrims kneel, the tourists whisper, and through the murky light of centuries, her face gazes back, pale, calm, unrotting. They call her Santa Lucia, Saint Lucy, the woman who lost her eyes and found eternity. Her coffin rests in Venice now, but her story began in blood. Lucia of Syracuse was born in the late 3rd century.
in a time when Rome's empire was cracking, but its cruelty remained intact. Her family was noble, her future arranged. She was promised to a pagan suitor, a match meant to secure fortune, not love. But Lucia's heart belonged elsewhere. She had consecrated her life to God. When her mother fell ill, she prayed at the tomb of Saint Agatha, another virgin martyr. Her mother was healed, and Lucia, seeing this miracle, gave away her dowry to the poor. Her fiancé, enraged, denounced her to the Roman governor. Faith, in that age, was a crime.
They tried to kill her, first by dragging her to a brothel, but her body became immovable, heavy as stone. Then by fire, but the flames would not touch her. So they turned to the sword. When they struck her throat, legend says she kept speaking. Even as blood filled her mouth, she whispered prayers for those who condemned her. And when she finally died, the Christians of Syracuse buried her in secret, beneath the catacombs, where light could not find her, but faith could. They said her eyes, gouged out by her persecutors, were later found whole again in her skull. And so she became the patron saint of sight, the one who could see even without eyes. Centuries passed. Rome fell, kingdoms rose, and the relics of saints became treasures more valuable than gold. Lucia's remains were moved again and again, from Syracuse to Constantinople, and finally, in 1204, to Venice. The Venetians claimed it was divine will. Others called it theft. During the Fourth Crusade, when Western armies looted the Byzantine capital, they carried her coffin across the sea. They said she belonged to the West now. But even saints, it seems, are never free from empire. Her body was placed in the Church of Santa Lucia, built solely to hold her, a sanctuary of marble and mist. And there she began her second life, not as martyr, but as miracle. Venice was the perfect home for a saint who would not rot, a city suspended between life and death, reflection and decay. Its canals shimmered like holy water, but its alleys reeked of damp and age. It was a city that lived by appearing eternal, and Lucy fit right in. Her coffin became one of its greatest relics. Pilgrims arrived by gondola, clutching candles, whispering prayers for sight, physical and spiritual alike. Artists painted her pale and radiant, eyes on a platter, halo bright. Her image was everywhere, in glass, in fresco, in gold leaf. The woman who could not be burned had become Venice's most luminous flame. But behind the beauty was an uneasy truth. Venice loved her not just for her sanctity, but for her spectacle.
The first glass coffin was installed in the 14th century, not for protection, but for display. Venice was a city of traders, artists, and pilgrims. To see was to believe, and faith, like commerce, thrived on visibility. Lucia's body was placed in a crystal sarcophagus, her face unveiled, her hands folded. Visitors could kneel and see holiness for themselves. Some fainted, some wept, some swore they saw her lips move. The church called it transparency. The merchants called it genius. For centuries, her incorrupt body drew ships to the lagoon, prayers to the altar, and coins to the coffers. She was both relic and advertisement, Venice's eternal guest. Those who saw her wrote in awe. They said her flesh was pale and waxen, her features untouched. Her eyelids closed gently over sockets once empty, her lips curved faintly upward, as if smiling at the living.
when plague swept Venice in 1575, the sick were brought to her chapel. Some claimed to recover. Others died whispering her name. The survivors said she glowed faintly in the dark, as if her faith still burned beneath the glass. Painters captured that glow. Caravaggio, in Rome, painted her death with brutal light and shadow. Tintoretto rendered her eyes as stars. Lucia became less a saint than a symbol, the woman who had seen God and whom even death could not dim. But miracles have a way of tempting thieves. In 1981, under cover of fog, St. Lucy vanished. Someone broke into her church, shattered the glass, and stole her body. When the nuns entered the next morning, the coffin was empty. Only the scent of incense remained. For days, Venice panicked. Was it ransom? Sacrilege? Revenge? The newspapers called it the crime of the century. Then, 11 days later, she returned. Found in an abandoned warehouse on the mainland, undamaged, untouched. No one ever learned who had taken her or why, but the people said Venice had called her home, that even in theft the sea had defended its saint. When she was returned to her coffin, the bells of the city rang as if for resurrection.
Today, Lucy lies not in her original church. It was demolished in the 19th century to make way for a railway line, but in the nearby church of San Jeremia. Her body rests behind bulletproof glass, beneath the veil of gold cloth. Her face, long darkened by time, is now covered with a silver mask molded in her likeness. Her hands, still folded, are gloved in white silk. Visitors can still see the outline of her, the shape of faith behind the veil. The light hits her coffin in such a way that it looks almost like water, shimmering, alive. Even through glass, she still seems to breathe. But what the faithful see is not the body itself. It is the reflection, faith made visible, yet untouchable. In Venice, saints are as much symbols as they are souls. Lucia's incorruptibility became part of the city's mythology, a proof of divine favor, an emblem of endurance. When the Republic of Venice declared independence from Rome, they invoked her name. We are under the eyes of Saint Lucy, who sees even without eyes. Her image appeared on banners, coins, and ships. Her relics were paraded through the streets during floods and wars. Each time, her body shimmered behind the glass, a mirror of the city itself, beautiful, decaying, and pretending not to. Because Venice, like Lucy, refused to rot. Modern scientists who examined her remains found traces of wax and linen, materials used to protect the body centuries ago. The Church never called it embalming. It called it reverent preservation. A difference of vocabulary, perhaps, but faith has always spoken its own language. And yet the mystery remains, for even with time and tampering, Lucia's form endures, not dust, not bone, but presence. Every December 13th, her feast day, the canals fill with light. Candles float across the water, each flame reflecting in the ripples like 100 tiny eyes. Venetians say she still watches over them, the blind saint who sees through fog. To stand before St. Lucy's coffin is to see yourself reflected, faintly, waveringly, in the same glass that guards her. Your face merges with hers for an instant. You see your own eyes beside the silver mask of the woman who gave hers away. And in that strange overlap, the line between faith and vanity blurs. Because Venice has always been a city of mirrors, and saints in the end are mirrors too. We see in them what we wish to see in ourselves. Lucia's incorrupt body does not promise immortality. It promises recognition, that someone or something still sees us even when our own eyes close.
In the evenings, when the tourists leave and the church falls quiet, the sisters of San Jeremiah lock the gates and light a single candle beside the coffin. The flame flickers in the glass. The reflection dances over Lucy's silver face. They say sometimes the glass fogs, just slightly, as if from breath. The sisters don't speak of it. They simply kneel, bow their heads, and whisper, "She watches still." And perhaps she does. Perhaps the incorrupt saint of sight never stopped seeing. Perhaps in the shimmering dark of Venice she watches not the world, but the souls that come to look back at her. Because the miracle was never that she refused to rot. It was that she refused to look away. The flesh may fall away, but the bones remember. They called them relics, fragments of saints, splinters of miracles, the dust of eternity. In the dim glow of cathedrals, behind glass and gold, they gleamed faintly. Skulls, ribs, fingers, hearts turned to stone, and bone turned to light. Each piece whispered the same promise, that holiness could survive dismemberment, that even in fragments, faith could shine. By the 12th century, Europe was an empire of relics. From Rome to Prague, from Canterbury to Cologne, churches competed for bones the way kings competed for land. Every fragment mattered, a jawbone, a tooth, a vial of blood. The incorrupt saints had proven that the body could resist time. But what if time could be divided, sanctity shared, one fragment at a time? The logic was simple. If one saint could perform miracles, then so could a piece of her. If holiness filled the body, then each bone, each drop, each relic retained a spark of it. And so began the great dissection of the divine. What had once been a miracle of wholeness became an economy of fragments. Relics were not simply stored, they were displayed. Coffins became lanterns, reliquaries, jeweled boxes, glass tubes, crystal orbs transformed bones into instruments of illumination. Candles burned around them day and night, their wax dripping over gold filigree, their flames trembling in the same rhythm as prayer. In the dim corners of cathedrals, these relics shimmered like constellations, stars of bone and silver. Pilgrims knelt before them as if before living beings. To touch a relic was to touch the edge of heaven. To carry one was to carry light through the dark. When pilgrims returned home, they swore their relics glowed faintly in the night, a pale phosphorescence like moonlight on skin. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps it was faith creating its own illumination. But in an age without electricity, that faint glow was enough to believe. In 1248, workers in Cologne made a discovery that would change Europe's idea of sanctity forever. Beneath the ruins of an old Roman temple, they found a chest of bones, said to be those of the Magi, the 3 wise men who followed the star to Bethlehem. The archbishop declared them genuine. The Holy Roman Emperor himself ordered a shrine built, a gilded reliquary taller than a man, studded with sapphires and pearls. When the bones were placed inside, witnesses claimed the air filled with light. The chroniclers wrote, "It was as if dawn had broken underground." From that moment on, Cologne became the city of holy light. Pilgrims came by the thousands, their candles flickering in the cathedral's vast shadow.
They called the shrine the Golden Coffin, a house of radiance made from dust. And there the bones of the dead became the sun. To medieval believers, light itself was divine language. God, they said, created light before life, and in that light all things were made visible and good. To glow was to be holy. Monks wrote that relics emitted lumen spirituale, spiritual light, visible not to the eyes but to the soul. Painters surrounded saints with golden halos to show what relics only hinted at: inner illumination, matter made pure. Even architecture joined the chorus. Cathedrals were built as vessels of light, their stained glass not to let in the sun, but to color it with faith. The relics at the center were the heart of that design, each one a captured sunrise. And when the candles went out, the glow seemed to linger. Not from the bone, perhaps, but from memory, the afterimage of belief.
Science, centuries later, would explain it. Some relics truly glowed. Certain minerals in the soil, phosphates, nitrates, calcium salts, absorbed into bone, making it faintly luminescent under candlelight. Even simple mold, feeding on ancient marrow, could emit a soft, greenish sheen. But to those who knelt before them, none of that mattered. Light was light, and holiness, once seen, could never be unseen. To the faithful, this was not chemical reaction, it was resurrection in miniature. The body, even reduced to dust, refused to disappear. The saint, long dead, still spoke, not in words, but in radiance. Where there was light, there was profit. The relic trade became one of the most lucrative enterprises in Europe. Bones, blood, and cloth traveled from monastery to market, wrapped in velvet and vows. Some were genuine, many were not. A single cathedral might claim half a dozen true fragments of the Holy Cross. More than one church claimed to hold the same saint's skull. One witty monk once wrote, "If all the relics of the saints were assembled, they would form an army large enough to retake Jerusalem." Yet faith persisted, because even counterfeits worked. People prayed before them, miracles occurred, and light fell all the same. Perhaps the relic itself mattered less than the devotion it inspired. Because in the end, the bone was only a lens. The believer was the flame. Nowhere did the theology of bones reach greater spectacle than in Rome itself, in the Capuchin crypt. There, the monks of the 17th century built chapels decorated entirely with their own remains. Skulls arranged in floral patterns, vertebrae forming chandeliers, femurs framing altars. The dead literally became the architecture of faith. Above one arch, they carved a message in Latin: "What you are, we once were. What we are, you will be." Tourists call it macabre. The monks called it revelation. A sermon made of bone and shadow. Each skull a candle that never burned out. And in that underground chapel, under the flicker of oil lamps, even the dead seemed to glow, not with decay, but with devotion.
But sometimes relics didn't just shine. They moved, they wept, they bled. In the 14th century, pilgrims in Italy claimed to see drops of liquid seeping from the bones of St. Nicholas of Myra, a substance they called manna sancta, holy myrrh. Bottles of it were sold across Christendom as divine medicine. To this day, the relics of St. Nicholas, now in Bari, still exude a clear fluid every December 6th. Scientists describe it as condensation. The faithful call it grace. And in that single drop,
glowing faintly in the lamplight, both science and faith see what they wish, chemistry for one, eternity for the other. There is something profoundly human about the relics, this instinct to break holiness into pieces, to hold the infinite in a single fingertip. Because to touch a relic is to bridge the impossible gap between time and eternity. A pilgrim in 1400 might kneel before the femur of a saint and feel for a heartbeat the warmth of the living world again. In that instant, the relic becomes not memory, but presence. The saint is not gone, merely smaller, more intimate. It's the same impulse that drives us to keep locks of hair, wedding rings, or letters from the dead. We do not preserve matter, we preserve meaning. The saints, too, became stories made solid. Even now, in an age of skepticism and science, relics remain. They rest behind glass in Paris, Krakow, Lisbon, and New York. Bone fragments in ornate cases, glowing faintly beneath LED light instead of candles. Scientists can explain their preservation, their chemistry, their history, but not their gravity. Because when the faithful kneel before them, something ancient stirs. That same quiet awe, that same trembling recognition that life, once lived with conviction, can still illuminate the dark. Perhaps the light no longer comes from the bone. Perhaps it comes from the eyes that behold it. In the end, every relic, real or imagined, tells the same story. That matter remembers what the soul forgets. That even when the body breaks, its fragments retain a pulse of light. That holiness, once kindled, never truly goes out. The saints may be dust now. Their bones may sleep in marble or crystal or shadow. But in the flicker of every candle, in the glow of every church window, in the quiet faith of those who still look upward, they burn on.
At night, when the cathedral's empty and the last candle is extinguished, a faint shimmer remains, an afterglow, imperceptible yet real. Tour guides call it phosphorescence. Believers call it presence. Either way, it lingers. Because holiness, like light, does not vanish, it only travels. And somewhere in that long journey from flesh to dust, from saint to relic, from shadow to shine, something eternal remembers its way home. Every miracle has a market. By the 13th century, the holy bones of Europe were no longer hidden in catacombs or sealed beneath altars. They were on the move, carried across borders, displayed in squares, sold in secret, traded for power. What had begun as reverence had become commerce, and faith, once born in silence, now spoke the language of gold. They called them reliquiae, remains. But by then, the word meant more than fragments of saints. It meant influence. It meant money. It meant miracles for sale. It started innocently enough. Pilgrims wanted tokens from holy places, a thread from a saint's robe, a chip from a tomb, a vial of oil said to have touched a martyr's bones. At first, the Church blessed these exchanges, calling them acts of devotion, but soon supply could not keep up with demand. Monks began to trade among themselves, relic for relic, fragment for fragment. Pilgrims paid to see, to touch, to pray, and from those coins churches rose, stone by stone, miracle by miracle. The business of belief had begun. Behind every Gothic cathedral stood a relic. Saint Denis in Paris, Saint James in Compostela, Saint Mark in Venice. Each claimed a body too sacred to question.
The relic was not just decoration, it was foundation. Pilgrims came to see it, their donations built the walls that enclosed it. The greater the saint, the richer the church. When the body of Saint Mark was smuggled from Alexandria to Venice in 828, hidden beneath barrels of pork to evade Muslim gods, the Venetians declared it a holy triumph. They built St. Mark's Basilica to house his remains, a cathedral so magnificent it seemed to shimmer like the miracle itself. Faith had found its currency, flesh.
Theft, too, became sacred. The church even had a word for it, forta sacra, holy theft. If a relic was stolen for the glory of God, it was not sin, but service. Monks crept into tombs at night, prying bones from coffins, wrapping them in cloth, and smuggling them across mountains. Cities celebrated these crimes as victories. In 1087, merchants from Bari stole the remains of St. Nicholas from Myra and brought them to Italy. They claimed the saint himself had guided them. When the tomb was opened, a sweet-scented oil flowed from his bones. Proof, they said, of divine approval. The Pope agreed. The theft became legend. And in the markets of Europe, every merchant prayed for such luck, a relic so pure it would justify its own price. The 12th century saw the rise of professional relic hunters, men and women who traveled across Christendom searching for bones to sell. Some claimed visions led them. Others simply followed rumor and profit. They carried forged letters of authenticity, stamped with counterfeit seals. They sold skulls said to belong to saints who never existed. They even sold secondary relics, objects that had merely touched the real thing. A cloth brushed against a coffin, a candle burned near an altar, a vial of water blessed by proximity. The faithful bought them eagerly, because in the Dark Ages, proximity to holiness was better than none at all. One chronicler complained, "There are more pieces of the true cross in Europe than trees in Jerusalem." And still demand grew. Rome could not ignore it forever. By the 13th century, the papacy began issuing decrees to control the relic trade. Only bishops could authenticate miracles. Selling relics was forbidden, under penalty of excommunication. But faith, like water, finds cracks. The trade did not stop, it simply went underground. Monks continued to barter relics discreetly. Pilgrims still paid donations for the privilege of seeing them. And every ban seemed only to increase their worth. For if holiness could be outlawed, it must truly be holy.
By the 15th century, relics were among the most valuable possessions in Europe. A single saint's finger could fund a monastery. A vial of holy blood could buy a fleet of ships. Kings collected them like trophies. Louis IX of France, later canonized himself, spent more on relics than on his army. He purchased the crown of thorns from Constantinople for a sum equivalent to half his kingdom's annual income, and built Sainte-Chapelle to house it. Its stained glass windows bathe the relic in light that still feels divine. It was the most beautiful vault ever built for a miracle. But not every collector was pious. Some bought relics for prestige, others for protection. A nobleman might keep a saint's tooth in his armor, believing it made him invincible. A queen might sleep beside a bone fragment to ensure fertility. Holiness became talisman, relic became charm. Faith had become fashion. Not all miracles could withstand inspection. In 1518, an inquisitor in Germany discovered that 3 different churches claimed to have the head of St. John the Baptist. One held him as a boy, one as a man, one as a skull of advanced sanctity. All were venerated, none were removed.
Luther, watching the trade with horror, called relics the bones of greed. He mocked the church for selling salvation in fragments. His protest, literal and figurative, set fire to Europe. Yet even after the Reformation shattered the old order, the relics remained, because faith, though wounded, still needed something to touch. During the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church turned relics into weapons of persuasion. Jesuits sent missionaries to distant lands carrying bone fragments in silver cases. Colonial churches in the Americas and Asia were filled with imported saints, some real, others invented. Bodies were disassembled and distributed across continents, a rib to Lima, a hand to Manila, a skull to Goa. The saints became global, their bones the first exports of belief. And for those far from Rome, these relics were proof that they were still seen, still connected to the divine empire. The body of Christendom had learned to multiply itself. By the 18th century, the relic trade had gone professional. Dealers in Rome, Naples, and Vienna operated like antique merchants. They sold certificates with wax seals, Latin signatures, and papal stamps, sometimes genuine, often not. Collectors bought entire skeletons assembled from anonymous bones, dressed in jeweled robes, and labeled as catacomb saints. These radiant corpses were placed in altars across Europe, silent, smiling, glittering under candlelight. Even skepticism could not dim them, because the human heart, tired of proof, still wanted beauty. In the 19th century, Pope Pius IX tried again to end the commerce. He declared all relic sales illegal and all certificates invalid unless approved by Rome. But by then, the black market was unstoppable. One Parisian dealer bragged that he could supply a complete saint or parts upon request. He offered the hand of Saint Anne or a choice selection of apostles. And buyers came, priests, nobles, even museums. The relic trade was no longer about salvation. It was about possession. Faith had become something to own. What then was lost in the buying and selling of the sacred? Perhaps not faith itself, but its silence. The relic once spoke softly from the shadows of a crypt. Now it shouted from glass and gold. The miracle once belonged to the unseen. Now it was ticketed, cataloged, and taxed. But the people still came. Because even when miracles are commodified, the longing behind them is real. They came not for authenticity, but for hope. Not for bones, but for what the bones promised. That the divine might still be close enough to touch. Even today, the trade endures. Online auctions list authenticated relics, tiny shards sealed in wax, marked ex ossibus sancti, from the bones of the saint. The Vatican condemns it, but the sales continue in secret corners of the web, a medieval market resurrected in pixels and PayPal. And somewhere, someone unwraps a relic from its packaging, a scrap of cloth, a splinter of bone, and holds it in trembling hands, not thinking of fraud or profit, but of prayer. The market, for all its sin, still serves its purpose, because longing, too, is a kind of holiness.
There is a small reliquary in Rome, no larger than a hand. Inside it rests a single bone the size of a matchstick. The gold case weighs 20 times more than what it contains, and yet, when pilgrims kneel before it,
The air still feels heavy. That is the paradox of faith. The infinite carried in the smallest things, the divine wrapped in human hands, the incorruptible traded by the corrupt. And maybe that's why the relics endure, because in every age, even one that measures everything, there remains a hunger for what cannot be measured, a fragment of the eternal, small enough to fit in a pocket, a miracle you can hold. They called them holy, but they looked like theater. Walk into a Baroque church in Europe and you'll see them, lying beneath glass, dressed in silk and jewels, faces serene, hands folded around rosaries that have not moved in centuries, bodies that refuse to die, bodies that refuse to rest. They are the incorrupt saints preserved for eternity, not hidden in crypts now, but displayed in light, encased in gold, admired like art. The Church calls them relics of devotion. Tourists call them strange. Historians call them evidence. But whatever the name, they lie there still, between reverence and spectacle, between heaven and museum. It began in the 17th century, the age of glass. Science had perfected transparency. Cathedrals embraced it. The Church, after centuries of guarding the miraculous in darkness, began to show it. Glass coffins were built like thrones, framed in gold and crystal. Every incorrupt saint became an exhibit of eternity. They called it ostentatio, the showing. To see was to believe, and belief required an audience. Bodies once buried in shadows now gleamed under chandeliers. The faithful no longer prayed to unseen miracles, they looked them in the eye. And thus, holiness became visible, and visibility became a kind of performance.
Venice had Saint Lucy, Naples had Saint Patricia, Paris had Saint Vincent de Paul, Rome had dozens, glass coffins lining chapels like galleries of the afterlife. Each body was carefully prepared, cloth restored, skin dusted with powders, lips painted faintly pink. Where time had left its mark, artisans intervened, repairing the miracle with brush and wax. The result was breathtaking, but not entirely honest. The saints looked less incorrupt than immortalized, untouched not by God, but by human hands. And still, no one complained, because beauty, too, can sanctify. The Church understood that faith needed symbols, and symbols needed perfection. So the incorrupt were curated like masterpieces, preserved, polished, posed beneath the golden light of devotion. The work was entrusted to craftsmen known as custodes sanctorum, keepers of the saints. They were sculptors, restorers, sometimes even morticians. Their job was to maintain the illusion of eternity. They cleaned the saints' robes with wine and vinegar. They replaced cracked fingers with carved ivory. They touched up faces with wax tinted by rose oil. Sometimes they added false eyelashes or glass eyes, not to deceive, but to dignify. Faith, after all, deserved presentation. A few saints even wore masks of silver or gold, molded to resemble their living faces. Behind the metal, the real features slept, hidden from decay and from doubt. It was as if the Church had decided the idea of the saint mattered more than the body itself. And maybe it did. Nowhere did this philosophy reach greater heights than in Rome, the city of marble and illusion.
Here, Baroque architects turned churches into stages, ceilings painted as heavens, altars blazing like sunrises. Light became theology. And beneath that light, the incorrupt saints lay, visible proof of glory, physical sermons in crystal coffins. To kneel before them was to kneel before eternity's reflection. The faithful whispered prayers, tourists whispered awe, and the saints, forever silent, lay between them, mirrors of both sorrow and hope. Because the miracle of incorruption had become something more complicated, not divine proof, but divine performance.
By the 19th century, the Enlightenment had changed everything. Science demanded evidence. Faith answered with display. Rome responded by making the incorrupt saints its quiet argument. Look, it said, you can see the miracle yourself. Visitors from across the world came to stare. They examined, photographed, studied. Pilgrims wept, scientists measured. Faith and reason shared the same viewing glass. It was beautiful and unsettling, because what was once sacred had become spectacle. The saints who had lived in silence now drew crowds like stars. In the Museum of San Francesco in Assisi, guides spoke of preservation techniques. In Naples, priests explained the natural oils that softened Saint Patricia's flesh. In Vienna, the jeweled skeletons of the catacomb saints glittered under electric light. And though the explanations multiplied, the feeling remained the same, that fragile tremor between awe and unease. The incorrupt became icons in the truest sense, visible theology. Each one told a story about purity, sacrifice, and the body made sacred. The Church used them to teach that holiness was not metaphor, but matter, the flesh redeemed, not discarded. But the longer they were displayed, the more they began to change in meaning. They became less about faith and more about endurance, less about salvation, more about survival. To look upon them was to see not just divine triumph, but the human refusal to vanish. They were, in a strange way, all of us, fighting time, seeking eternity through glass and gold. The irony of incorruption is that even the unrotting need maintenance. Air seeps through cracks. Light fades cloth. Humidity breeds mold. Even miracles decay under scrutiny. The Church employs restorers now, trained conservators who use museum tools to clean relics once tended by prayer. They monitor temperature, polish glass, control moisture. The language has changed, but the reverence remains. Where monks once whispered hymns, curators whisper calibration. The miracle has become conservation. Yet somehow that feels fitting, because what they preserve now is not just a body, but a story.
Today, in cathedrals and chapels from Krakow to Quito, the incorrupt still draw the crowds. Selfie sticks rise beside rosaries. Whispers mix with camera clicks. Faith and fascination stand shoulder to shoulder. For some, it's worship. For others, it's morbid curiosity. But all are drawn by the same gravity, the promise that eternity might be visible, that death might be gentle, that beauty might outlast rot. The saints have become global icons, not of religion, but of endurance, and in that they may be more relevant now than ever, because in a world obsessed with preservation, of youth, of fame, of image, the incorrupt saints are the oldest mirrors we have. They remind us what immortality costs. Beneath the gold, the jewels, the glass, there is still silence. If you kneel long enough, the performance fades, the light softens, the air cools. And in that stillness, the illusion dissolves.
you begin to see the truth, not of preservation, but of surrender. These bodies are not defiant, they are patient, they are at peace. The incorrupt saints do not resist death, they rest within it, calmly, completely. And that serenity is the real miracle. The gold only amplifies what the flesh already knew. Behind every church of glass coffins, there are rooms the public never sees, the maintenance chambers, where the saints are cleaned, dressed, and repaired. Here miracles are dusted, relics are measured. Faith is handled with gloves. It is an act of quiet devotion, not deceit. The caretakers know the difference between performance and presence, but they tend both with equal tenderness, because to them, these saints are not artifacts. They are companions, reminders that eternity, too, must be cared for. One restorer once said, "When I polish the glass, I see my face reflected in the saint's coffin. It feels like confession."
If you ever stand before an incorrupt saint, in Venice, Rome, or Paris, do not rush. Look closely. You'll see your own reflection in the glass. For a moment, the living and the dead share the same frame, the same light, the same fragile hope. The gold may glitter, the air may smell of wax, but beneath it all, something human endures. That ancient wish to be remembered, to remain, to be seen. The saints beneath glass and gold are not proof of eternity, they are its echo. And in their silence, we hear the oldest prayer of all. Do not let me fade. Faith asked for miracles, science asked for evidence, and somewhere between them, the saints kept their silence. For centuries, the incorrupt saints were proof that holiness could conquer decay, that faith could suspend nature. But by the 20th century, belief had a new adversary, reason. And reason brought its instruments, microscopes, scalpels, and curiosity sharp enough to cut through miracles. The laboratories of the modern world were ready to weigh eternity, and for the first time ever, heaven would be studied under glass. It began quietly. In the early 1900s, the Vatican authorized a series of discrete examinations on incorrupt bodies. The goal was not to disprove miracles, but to understand them, or at least to explain what could be explained. Behind the sealed doors of Rome's catacombs and monasteries, priests and scientists stood side by side over coffins that had not been opened for centuries. Candles flickered beside microscopes, prayers preceded scalpels. What they found was not heresy, but complexity. Some bodies were dried like parchment, a natural mummification caused by arid tombs. Others were wax-coated, intentionally or accidentally preserved by the oils and resins used in burial. A few were chemically embalmed, a practice older than anyone had realized. And yet, some truly defied every category. Flesh still pliant, skin still soft, scents of roses lingering where there should have been rot. The reports describe these cases as inexplicable by current means. That phrase became the Church's new miracle. In 1955, the incorrupt body of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, the young girl who saw the Virgin Mary at Lourdes, was examined again. Her body had been opened multiple times before, but now technology could see what eyes could not. X-rays revealed her bones intact, organs desiccated but unspoiled. There was no sign of embalming, no resin, no chemical preservation. Her flesh, though hardened, remained flexible, as if asleep, not dead. Doctors debated in Latin and French. The Church simply wrote, "Nature has imitated grace."
Her face, now covered with a wax mask to prevent damage, rests behind glass in Nevers, France. Visitors still whisper that she looks alive. Science confirmed that she is not. Faith insists that it hardly matters. In 1933, the coffin of Saint Catherine Labouré was opened in Paris. She had been buried for 57 years. Her skin was smooth, her eyes still faintly blue. When doctors examined her body, they found no trace of decay and no trace of embalming either. The scientific report concluded, cautiously, no natural explanation can be offered. The Church, careful not to label every mystery divine, declared her incorruptibility a sign of special grace, not suspension of nature. It was a small distinction, but an important one. Faith had learned to survive scrutiny by redefining miracle not as defiance of science, but as its complement. The body, once proof of divinity, had become dialogue. As forensic science advanced, more saints entered laboratories. Histologists studied skin tissue under microscopes. Chemists tested samples for preservatives. Physicists examined temperature and humidity conditions of ancient tombs, and slowly patterns emerged. Dry climates, sealed coffins, high mineral content in soil, linen soaked in aromatic oils, all these could create natural mummification, the illusion of incorruption. But every rule had its exception. Some bodies, sealed in damp tombs, remained whole when logic demanded they should have turned to dust. Others, buried in identical conditions, decayed in days. Science could explain many, but not all. And in those few, rare, stubborn exceptions, faith found its foothold again.
One of the strangest mysteries, the odor of sanctity, also came under the microscope. In 1976, researchers tested air samples from several tombs of so-called fragrant saints. They found traces of natural oils, geraniol, linalool, and benzoates, compounds associated with roses and herbs used in medieval burial rites. But the concentrations were too high to explain naturally. Some tombs, long sealed, released air rich with floral notes that no chemical process could fully replicate. Was it the lingering residue of oils, or something more? Science published the data. The Church, as always, simply said, "The fragrance of grace remains." And perhaps both were right, because explanation and mystery are not enemies, they are languages for the same experience. Not everyone was convinced. Secular historians accused the Church of selective transparency, publicizing only the inexplicable, ignoring the explainable. Every miracle, one critic wrote, is a question of lighting and timing. But within the Vatican, some scientists, even unbelievers, came away unsettled. One forensic expert, after examining the incorrupt body of Saint Sylvan in Croatia, confessed, "I cannot explain this, but neither can I deny what I see. It is not illusion, it is presence." That word, presence, replaced miracle. It was safer, but deeper. It suggested not impossibility, but endurance. A body that remained when all others did not. By the 1980s, the Church had developed formal protocols for verifying miracles of incorruption. Each case was now handled like a scientific study. Independent observers, sealed reports, forensic photographs, chemical analyses. Many failed the test. Some decayed upon exposure. Others revealed signs of resin or wax that previous centuries had mistaken for flesh. But the Church did not despair.
It adapted. The incorrupt body was no longer required for sainthood. Faith no longer needed proof in skin and bone. What mattered was life, not death. And yet, the investigations continued, because curiosity, too, is a kind of prayer.
Among the hundreds examined, a handful remained defiant. Saint Sylvan of Dubrovnik, body flexible, skin soft, no embalming. Saint Veronica Giuliani, 200 years untouched, flesh unbroken. Saint Zita of Lucca, 4 centuries intact, no chemical found. Saint Bernadette, lifelike still after 140 years. Science catalogs them as anomalies. Faith calls them reminders. The Church, in its cautious wisdom, calls them mysteria incorrupta, the mysteries of the uncorrupted. Each phrase is correct in its own way. Each admits that, for all our instruments, some things remain beyond measure. Modern imaging has gone further. MRI scans, carbon dating, DNA sequencing, all have been used on relics and bodies once considered untouchable. The results are humbling. Some are centuries older or younger than believed. Some belong not to saints, but to ordinary people preserved by luck. Yet even in these misidentifications, faith persists, because what matters is not whose bones they are, but what they represent. The longing for the eternal within the temporary. In sterile labs filled with machines and hums, scientists stare at the same phenomenon monks once did in candlelight. They call it anomaly. But when the lights dim and silence fills the room, they feel it too. That quiet reverence, that unnameable awe. Even in the age of fluorescence, holiness glows. Today, the Church and science coexist in an uneasy truce. The Vatican has a Pontifical Academy of Sciences, a forum where physicists, biologists, and theologians discuss miracles without mockery. They no longer ask, "Is this supernatural?" They ask, "What does this mean?" Because after centuries of study, the question has changed. The incorruptible body is no longer proof of God's intervention. It is a mirror of human desire to endure, to be remembered, to transcend decay. And that, perhaps, is the truest miracle, that our yearning itself survives dissection.
In a quiet laboratory in Rome, one final test is sometimes done. A small piece of fabric or hair from an incorrupt saint is placed under magnification. Cells are examined. No life remains, no regeneration, no secret substance. And yet, when the scientists finish their notes, they pause before discarding the sample. Because in that tiny strand of flesh, something ancient looks back, not in motion, but in meaning. A story, written in the language of atoms and awe. No test can measure that. In the end, science did not destroy the miracles, it clarified them. It stripped away myth to reveal something quieter, the persistence of mystery itself. The incorrupt saints still lie behind glass, their faces calm under modern bulbs instead of candles. Their preservation, explained or not, continues to draw the living close. Because the question was never how they endure, it was why we need them to. And perhaps that answer, too, belongs to both science and faith. The simple truth that the human spirit cannot stand the thought of vanishing, and will always search for proof in bodies or in stars, that something, anything, resists the dark.
The living built cities for themselves. The dead built one beneath them. If you walk the streets of Europe, you walk on history, layers of it, stacked like pages. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of traffic and the murmur of prayers, there is another sound, a faint hush, a breath drawn by no lungs, the whisper of the city of bones. They say the earth remembers, and nowhere does it remember more faithfully than under the cathedrals, in the vast hidden necropolises where saints, monks, and ordinary souls sleep together in arranged eternity.
In the beginning, there were tombs, small, simple, secret. Early Christians buried their dead in catacombs beneath Rome, painting doves and fish upon the walls to mark their hope in resurrection. They prayed among the corpses, believing the souls above could hear. But as centuries passed and cemeteries overflowed, those underground halls grew, mile upon mile of tunnels, chambers, and altars carved out of soft stone. The living worshipped above. The dead waited below. Two worlds stacked upon each other like reflection and shadow. The faithful called these places the Sleeping City, because even in death, the saints were said to dream. By the Middle Ages, Europe's population had outgrown its graveyards. Plague, war, and famine filled the ground faster than the living could bless it. So they began to move the bones. In Paris, Rome, Vienna, and Prague, cemeteries were emptied, skeletons exhumed, cleaned, stacked carefully underground. The remains of millions found new homes beneath the streets. And in time, those bones were arranged, not in chaos, but in art. Walls of skulls, columns of femurs, chandeliers of vertebrae, chapels built from what remained of centuries. The bones were not macabre to them, they were sacred. They were reminders that death was not the end, only the architecture of what comes next. It began with necessity. By the late 1700s, Paris was drowning in its own dead. The city's graveyards overflowed. Corpses surfaced after every rain. Disease spread. The air itself turned sour. And so in 1786, the city opened its old quarries beneath Montparnasse, tunnels carved from limestone centuries earlier. Night after night, under torchlight, carts of bones were brought through the streets. Priests walked ahead, chanting psalms. By dawn, the remains of entire cemeteries had vanished underground. 6 million souls, all stacked in silence. Today, tourists walk those tunnels by electric light. The walls are made of skulls, arranged like bricks, the sockets staring out in orderly rows. Between them, plaques bear short phrases, reminders written for the living.
Stop. This is the empire of death. Where is death's victory when you walk among her trophies? And as you descend, the air cools, the city's heartbeat fades, and you realize something strange. The place feels peaceful. This is not horror. This is patience. Elsewhere in Europe, the bones became beauty. In Kutna Hora, a small town in Bohemia, the Sedlic ossuary gleams with chandeliers made from human skulls and femurs. Every bone is cleaned, polished, placed with geometric care. The altar is framed by ribs. The ceiling glows with the pale symmetry of mortality. In Rome, beneath the church of Santa Maria della Concezione, the Capuchin monks arranged their dead into patterns of devotion. Floral arches of skulls, winged cherubs sculpted from pelvises. They called it a sermon in silence. And in Portugal, The Chapel of Bones bears a warning carved above its entrance. We bones that are here, for yours we wait. To modern eyes, it seems macabre, but to those who built it, it was compassion. A reminder that death was not an ending, but a companion, always near, never cruel, always honest. The monks who arranged these bones did so not with fear, but with tenderness. Each skull was handled with prayer, each skeleton cleaned with reverence. They did not see death as horror, but as duty. To them, the dead were brothers, silent teachers, reminding the living of humility. In their arrangement of bones, they found theology. The skull became the symbol of wisdom, the spine of faith, the hands of charity. It was art without ego, the art of surrender. And in those silent cathedrals of bone, the air itself seemed to hum, not with decay, but with devotion.
Amid the countless anonymous dead, there were always the incorrupt. Bodies that resisted decay even when surrounded by millions of bones. Their coffins remained untouched, their faces serene, while the rest turned to dust. Pilgrims saw this as divine hierarchy, holiness shining in the dark. The incorrupt became the beating hearts of these underground sanctuaries. They were placed in glass coffins at the center, lit by flickering lamps. In the catacombs of Palermo, the child Rosalia Lombardo still lies with her curls intact, her lips faintly smiling. She was only 2 years old when she died in 1920. Her father's grief led to preservation so perfect that even a century later, she looks asleep. Scientists have studied her formula: arsenic, alcohol, glycerin, and mystery. But her peace remains inexplicable. The monks call her the Sleeping Beauty. The faithful call her a miracle. And visitors, no matter their belief, lower their voices in her presence, because she reminds them some silences are sacred. The ossuaries speak without sound. Every skull tells a story once spoken in laughter, prayer, or fear. Now all that remains are the echoes of what mattered. The arrangement of bones is not decoration, it is translation. The human form rewritten into architecture. Look closely and you'll see something subtle. The symmetry is not perfect. A rib slightly misaligned. A femur shorter than the rest. It's as if the builders wanted the imperfections to remain. A quiet confession that eternity, like life, is never flawless. The saints, the sinners, the forgotten, all equal here. No rank, no crown, no title. Only bone.
Today, the ossuaries are tourist destinations. Tickets are sold. Guides lead tours. Flashlights illuminate the skulls once touched by monks' hands. Selfies replace candles. Whispers replace prayers. And yet, even in this modern noise, the stillness endures. The bones do not judge. They simply exist. The oldest museum of what it means to be human. Some visitors leave uneasy. Others strangely comforted. One inscription in the Sedlec ossuary reads, "Death does not divide, it collects." It's true, because in these cathedrals of remains, there is no separation, only continuity. The living and the dead share the same air, the same story. There's a feeling, walking through those tunnels, that the earth itself is breathing.
You feel it. Cool air moving softly between walls of bone, as if the planet inhales through the past. It is the respiration of memory, the slow, patient heartbeat of all who came before. It reminds you that history isn't just written in books. It's stored in matter. The same calcium that built these skulls builds our teeth. The same minerals that preserve them flow in our blood. We are made of the same material. We are simply their continuation. The saints and the unknown dead, they are not gone. They are the architecture beneath our cities, the foundation beneath our faith. When the monks finished the ossuaries, they did not see them as morbid. They saw them as meditations, visual sermons. They believed that to live well, one must look at death without fear, and so they turned death into geometry, into pattern, into peace. The bones do not mourn. They simply wait. And in that waiting, there is serenity. Because to accept death is not to give up life. It is to understand it. The incorrupt saints, the arranged skeletons, the anonymous millions, all tell the same story, that eternity does not erase. It rearranges.
If you ever find yourself beneath one of these churches, in the tunnels of Paris, or the chambers of Rome, or the golden chapel of Sedlec, stop for a moment. Turn off your flashlight. Let the darkness breathe. You'll hear it, that faint, impossible sound, the echo of millions of souls asleep, the hush of centuries compressed into dust and silence. It's not frightening, it's gentle, like the exhale of the earth itself, content in its remembering. And in that moment, you'll understand the truth that both faith and science whisper in different languages. Nothing is lost, not even us. We are all just waiting to be rearranged. The mouth was closed, but the message continued. In every age, there have been whispers, stories of saints whose bodies did not merely resist decay, but refused silence. Voices in the dark, eyes that opened, hearts that bled centuries after burial. To the faithful, these were signs that grace does not end with death. To skeptics, they were stories shaped by grief. And between the two, the church stood quietly, unsure whether to kneel or to investigate. Because the dead, when they speak, do not do so in words. They speak through signs, through scent, through movement, through the tremor of flesh that should not move again. The earliest account comes from the 4th century, the death of Saint Martin of Tours. When his body was laid out for burial, witnesses said his face changed expression. The lines of suffering vanished. A faint smile appeared. Some said they heard a sigh escape his lips, like a man waking from sleep. It was recorded by Sulpicius Severus, his friend and biographer, who wrote, "He seemed not to die, but to rest his eyes and breathe again." Whether it was air trapped in the lungs or faith trapped in longing, no one could say. But the legend spread, and with it a strange idea took root, that the truly holy did not stop communicating when they died. They simply changed language.
In the Middle Ages, the earth itself seemed to speak through the saints. Bodies buried in secret were found fresh and bleeding when exhumed, their wounds reopening as if newly inflicted. The most famous of these was Saint Stanislaus of Krakow. He was cut to pieces for defying a king, his body scattered across a field. Weeks later, the fragments were said to have reassembled. When the grave was opened, his flesh was whole again, the cuts sealed, the blood still red.
Historians would later call it a metaphor for Poland's rebirth, but the people of Krakow believed it literally. They said the saint had bled for justice, and even death had not silenced his protest. To them, it was not miracle or myth, it was testimony. In 1290, in the Tuscan village of Lucca, a young woman named Zita died after a lifetime of quiet charity. 40 years later, her coffin was opened. Her body was perfectly preserved, her face serene. But witnesses claimed something impossible. As the air touched her lips, they parted slightly, and a warm breath escaped. The bishop's report, written with care, described it as a sigh, soft as wind over a candle. The church never declared it supernatural, but pilgrims swore it was proof that saints breathe still, not with lungs, but with grace. Her incorrupt body remains in Lucca to this day. Visitors lean close to the glass, as if waiting for her to exhale again. The strangest stories are always about hearts. In 1732, when the coffin of Saint Veronica Giuliani was opened, her heart was removed for examination. The nuns who cut into it found faint markings, symbols, they said, burned into the tissue itself. A cross, a crown of thorns, and the letters IHS, the monogram of Christ. They swore the heart pulsed once, briefly, before falling still. Doctors called it imagination. The church called it a mystery. Either way, the heart remains preserved, red, luminous, encased in glass, as though refusing to fade even in death. Perhaps that is what the faithful meant by speech. Not words, but signs, a language written in flesh.
In 1582, the body of Saint Teresa of Avila was being transported from her convent to a new tomb. The journey took 12 days, through rain and heat. When they opened the coffin to check for damage, her body had not decayed, but more startlingly, her limbs had shifted. Her hands were clasped differently, her head tilted toward the light. Her expression had softened. The nuns believed she had adjusted herself, even in death, to face heaven. They buried her again, but not before cutting off one hand as a relic. It remains flexible to this day, a relic that bends without breaking. And those who have held it say it feels warm. Science calls it residual oils, preserved skin. Faith calls it gesture. Perhaps the most enduring of all posthumous miracles is the one that repeats itself every year, the blood of St. Januarius, patron of Naples. His dried blood, sealed in a glass vial since the 4th century, liquefies 3 times each year, in May, in September, and in December. The church displays it in the cathedral, held by a priest before thousands of onlookers. Slowly, the dark dust within the vial turns red and fluid, sloshing like living blood. The people cheer, the bells ring, the miracle lives again. Scientists have proposed theories: thixotropic gels, iron oxides, chemical suspension. But no one has replicated it precisely. And so every year, Naples waits to see if the blood will move. When it does not, as happened in 1527, 1944, and again in 1980, disaster follows. Plague, war, earthquake. Coincidence or not, the people still hold their breath, because for them, the saint still speaks, not in words, but in warnings. In 1953, in Syracuse, Sicily, a plaster image of the Virgin Mary was said to have wept human tears. Tests confirmed the liquid matched human composition: saline, protein, and sorrow. The statue was declared miraculous. But decades earlier,
A similar phenomenon had been reported with an incorrupt saint, Saint Mary Magdalene de Pazzi. Her body, displayed for centuries, was said to have released a single tear during prayer on the anniversary of her death. Witnesses swore it rolled down her cheek and vanished before it reached the chin. No one could prove it. No one could forget it. Perhaps the tear was moisture or condensation. Perhaps it was the universe exhaling empathy. Either way, it spoke. Gently, wordlessly, to the grief that unites all living and dead. Throughout medieval Europe, pilgrims reported faint sounds within the tombs of saints. Not voices exactly, more like sighs, whispers, or the rustle of robes. The church called them miracula sonorum, miracles of sound. Skeptics blamed air pressure, echo, or shifting stone. But the pilgrims heard language. In 1420, in Assisi, monks swore they heard St. Francis's coffin emit a low hum during evening prayer on the anniversary of her death. Witnesses swore it rolled down her cheek and vanished before it reached the chin. No one could prove it. No one could forget it. Perhaps the tear was moisture or condensation. Perhaps it was the universe exhaling empathy. Either way, it spoke gently, wordlessly, to the grief that unites all living and dead. Throughout medieval Europe, pilgrims reported faint sounds within the tombs of saints. Not voices exactly, more like sighs, whispers, or the rustle of robes. The church called them miracula sonorum, miracles of sound. Skeptics blamed air pressure, echo, or shifting stone. But the pilgrims heard language. In 1420, in Assisi, monks swore they heard St. Francis's coffin emit a low hum during evening prayer on the anniversary of her death. Witnesses swore it rolled down her cheek and vanished before it reached the chin. No one could prove it. No one could forget it. Perhaps the tear was moisture or condensation. Perhaps it was the universe exhaling empathy. Either way, it spoke gently, wordlessly, to the grief that unites all living and dead. Throughout medieval Europe, pilgrims reported faint sounds within the tombs of saints. Not voices exactly, more like sighs, whispers, or the rustle of robes. The church called them miracula sonorum, miracles of sound. Skeptics blamed air pressure, echo, or shifting stone. But the pilgrims heard language. In 1420, in Assisi, monks swore they heard St. Francis's coffin emit a low hum during evening prayer on the anniversary of her death. Witnesses swore it rolled down her cheek and vanished before it reached the chin. No one could prove it. No one could forget it. Perhaps the tear was moisture or condensation. Perhaps it was the universe exhaling empathy. Either way, it spoke gently, wordlessly, to the grief that unites all living and dead. Officially, the Church calls these events signa devotionis, signs of devotion, meant not to prove, but to inspire. Unofficially, priests and pilgrims alike continue to listen, because somewhere between science and prayer, the saints still find ways to be heard.
Maybe the incorrupt bodies never truly spoke, or sighed, or wept. Maybe the movement, the warmth, the breath,
were all the reflections of those who stood beside them, hearts so full of reverence that they felt it returned. But maybe that's the point. Faith is not a dialogue of logic. It's an echo. We speak into eternity, and sometimes it answers in the only language it can, through light, through scent, through the stillness of bodies that seem alive. Perhaps the saints who spoke after death were not defying nature, but amplifying it, reminding the living that silence is never empty, and that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we think. Stand before any incorrupt saint and you'll feel it, that faint pressure in the air, as if the space itself remembers breath. The silence hums softly, like a held note in a song long ended. It is not a haunting, it is continuation. Because every story ever told about the saints, every sigh, every drop of blood, every whisper, carries the same message. That life, when lived in devotion, does not vanish. It reverberates. And though centuries pass, the echo remains, not in lungs or lips, but in the quiet awe that fills the living whenever we stand too close to the impossible. Not every miracle is meant for the eyes. Beneath the Vatican, beneath the marble, the frescoes, and the echo of prayers in Latin, lies another world. A labyrinth of corridors, chambers, and sealed rooms that few will ever see. They call it Il Deposito Sacro, the sacred repository. To the public, it does not exist. To the Church, it is the quiet heart of its mysteries. It is said that here, in darkness cool as a crypt and clean as a laboratory, the incorrupt saints who cannot be explained are kept, not on display, but in waiting. A vault of bodies that refuse to decay, stored not for adoration, but for study, and perhaps for protection, because some miracles, the Church believes, are too fragile for light. Visitors who have seen the vault, few and all sworn to silence, describe a place that feels older than the Vatican itself. Marble steps descending into cool air, walls lined with copper doors, each marked by a simple cross and number.
No names, no inscriptions. Inside, each chamber holds what the Church calls preserved sanctity, incorrupt bodies, relics too delicate or too mysterious for public viewing. Some are known saints, others are unnamed, the forgotten faithful whose preservation defied all expectation. Electric lamps hum softly beside old candles that are never lit. The air smells faintly of myrrh and dust. It is said that the stillness here is unlike any other, not silence, but attention. The vault is watched by a small order of priests known as the Custodes Mortis, the keepers of the dead. Their role is not ceremonial. It is custodial, almost scientific. They inspect the bodies twice a year, record temperature and humidity, and maintain the coffins that hold them. Most are trained in theology and medicine both. They pray before they measure. They bless before they touch. Their notes are written in Latin, stored in sealed ledgers marked restricted. No photographs are allowed. One former custode, in an anonymous letter published decades later, wrote, "I have seen flesh that was soft after 500 years, eyes that gleamed beneath dust, lips that whispered air. We do not call it miracle, we call it mystery that watches back." The Vatican never confirmed his account, but they never denied it either. Rumors say there are over 200 incorrupt bodies stored within the Vatican's vaults, though no record confirms it. Among them are said to be saints whose preservation defies even modern explanation, and others whose authenticity the Church quietly questions. There are stories of a nun from Seville, buried in clay, whose body never dried and whose pupils still reflect light. A young martyr from the catacombs, whose skin remains warm when touched. An unnamed pope, discovered centuries after burial, perfectly preserved without embalming, then reinterred in silence. And a child, anonymous and radiant, found incorrupt in a forgotten crypt beneath the Lateran, identity unknown, faith unrecorded.
Each rests behind glass too thick to break, in humidity calibrated to the breath of centuries. The Church does not call it a collection, it calls it a responsibility. Because holiness, they say, must be preserved, even when no one is meant to see it. There is another room, rarely mentioned and never visited by pilgrims, La Stanza della Verità, the room of truth. It is where the Church allows science to look closely. Forensic experts from the Pontifical Academy are granted brief, closely monitored access. Samples are taken under prayer. Tissue examined for bacteria, minerals, and traces of resin. The goal is not exposure, but understanding. And yet, every test seems to end the same way. Chemical signatures too ordinary to explain the extraordinary. Conditions too inconsistent to replicate. Preservations too perfect to dismiss. A Vatican archivist once wrote in a margin note never meant to be read, "Each miracle dissolves under observation, and yet remains. The more we study, the more the silence grows." There are also those who are never studied. Bodies the Church has chosen to leave untouched, sealed in glass and silence, not out of fear, but reverence. One legend speaks of the sleeping cardinal, a man buried in 1637 whose body never stiffened. When moved centuries later, his fingers bent softly, as if to bless. Another is the Bride of Christ, a nun found incorrupt but covered in crystalline dust, a thin layer that sparkles like frost, impossible to remove without damaging the skin. The Vatican calls these unverified preservations. Their chambers remain locked. Their stories survive only in whispers. Not all visitors to the vault are scientists. Sometimes saints visit saints. Popes and cardinals occasionally descend in private to pray, to reflect, to remind themselves of what endures beyond power. Pope John XXIII was said to have knelt there the night before the Second Vatican Council opened in 1962. He returned silent, pale, but peaceful. When asked later what he had seen, he smiled and said only, "The Church remembers what even time forgets." No record of his visit appears in the archives, but among those who serve beneath the Vatican, memory does not require proof. To stand in that underground stillness, one custode wrote, is to feel language itself unravel. Words like life and death, faith and proof lose meaning. There is only continuity, flesh without time, matter without decay. He described it as the quiet weight of eternity. When he left the vault after 10 years of service, he refused interviews for the rest of his life. But on his deathbed, he told a single story, that once, while checking the vault alone at night, he heard faint singing. He followed the sound to a chamber where the air trembled faintly, like a low hum. Inside,
nothing moved. But the sound, a wordless choir, continued. He wrote no explanation, only this line: "Perhaps the saints are not silent. Perhaps we are just deaf." Somewhere within the Vatican archives, beneath sealed layers of bureaucracy and prayer, lies what insiders call il libro immortale, the immortal book. It is rumored to record every known case of incorruption since the 4th century. Thousands of names, conditions, notes. Some marked miraculum probatum, miracle approved. Others marked silentium, silence required. No one outside the church has ever seen it. No scholar has quoted from it. But the pattern is known. Every few decades, a new name is added. A new body that defies the rules. And so the vault grows quietly fuller. A library not of words, but of flesh.
Why keep them hidden? Because faith, the Church believes, must protect its mysteries as much as proclaim them. Too much light can kill wonder. Too much proof can erode reverence. And perhaps some miracles, like relics themselves, are meant to rest unseen, to remind the world that not everything must be explained. The Vatican's vault is not a denial of faith, it is its defense. Down there, the incorrupt saints are neither spectacle nor secret. They are memory made matter, the living archives of belief. And above them, the city moves on. Pilgrims walk St. Peter's Square, cameras flash, bells ring. Few imagine that beneath their feet lies a congregation that never ends. If the rumors are true, the Custodes Mortis end every inspection with the same prayer, whispered in Latin. Domine custodi eos sicut ipsi custodiant fidem. Lord, keep them as they keep the faith. And then they close the doors, turn off the lamps, and ascend, leaving the saints to their eternal vigil in the quiet below. No trumpets, no hymns, no proof. Only that sacred stillness, the Church's most ancient ally. Because even in the heart of reason, faith keeps its secret chambers. And in those chambers, the incorrupt continue to rest, not as relics, not as evidence, but as reminders that silence, too, can be holy. Sometimes, late at night, the lights flicker in St. Peter's Basilica. The guards blame old wiring. The faithful smile knowingly. Because maybe, just maybe, the saints beneath are stirring again. Not to be seen, but simply to remind the living that even buried under marble and centuries, grace still breathes. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to keep the world believing.
Even when the flesh fades, the belief remains, soft, unrotting, eternal. When the last saint turns to dust, something will still remain. Not the body, not the relic, but the story. Because the true incorruptible has never been the flesh, it has always been the faith that guards it. For 2,000 years, the Church has preserved bones and bodies, hearts and hands, eyes that refuse to rot. But behind every preserved relic stands something more enduring, the devotion that refused to decay with it. It is faith, not salt or resin, that keeps the sacred alive. And perhaps, in the end, it is belief itself that is the world's oldest preservative. In ancient times, before the Church, before even Rome, people feared forgetting more than they feared dying. To be remembered was to live again. The Greeks called it kleos, the glory sung by others. The Egyptians mummified their kings to anchor memory to matter. The first Christians did the same, not with gold or linen,
but with prayer. They believed that every saint was a mirror of Christ's eternity, that by touching a relic, by speaking a name, they kept that eternity alive in the world. And so, when flesh resisted decay, they saw it as proof that memory, when wrapped in love, could resist time. They weren't wrong. Every faith begins with an act of preservation, a word written down, a ritual repeated, a life remembered. The relics of saints are simply the most tangible form of that instinct, the attempt to hold on to the divine moment before it fades. When St. Francis's robe was torn, his followers kept the pieces. When St. Clare died, they saved her hair. When St. Teresa of Avila's heart was removed, they sealed it in silver. Because holiness, once encountered, could not be discarded. It is the same reason we keep wedding rings, letters, photographs, fragments of meaning made physical. Faith and love share the same logic. Both preserve what they fear to lose.
The pilgrims who traveled to see incorrupt saints were not seeking proof. They were seeking proximity, a closeness to the divine that life rarely offers. They carried candles, coins, sickness, and sorrow, and laid them at the feet of bodies that seemed immune to the world's corrosion. What they really left behind was fear. Fear of death, fear of being forgotten, fear that their faith might not outlast their flesh. And when they left, they carried something invisible but lasting, the quiet certainty that holiness could still inhabit the earth, that the divine did not stay distant, but lingered in the bones of those who had loved deeply enough. For centuries, caretakers have tended the incorrupt saints. They clean their coffins, polish their glass, light their candles. Their devotion is not about spectacle, but stewardship. They believe that tending to the dead keeps the living whole, that to maintain a saint's body is to maintain the soul of faith itself. In 19th century Naples, one nun spent her entire life caring for the body of Saint Patricia. Every morning she whispered, "We keep each other alive." When she died, another took her place. The chain has never broken. The saints remain incorrupt, and so does the faith that tends them, because both depend on the other. Holiness, like any flame, survives only if someone keeps watch. Science studies what resists decay. Faith studies why. From a chemical view, incorruption is rare preservation, controlled environments, dryness, and chance. From a spiritual view, it is something purer, the transmutation of time through love. Faith, after all, is its own kind of alchemy. It turns suffering into meaning, loss into memory, decay into devotion. Every church, every prayer, every relic is a small experiment in endurance, the soul's quiet defiance of entropy. And in that defiance lies the real miracle. Not that the saints refused to rot, but that belief refused to die.
The incorrupt saints were never meant to glorify the body itself. They were parables, metaphors carved in flesh. The message was simple. If even matter could resist corruption, so could the soul. The unrotting flesh became the church's symbol for virtue that endures, purity that no sin nor time can spoil. It was not the skin that mattered, but the lesson it carried. Because holiness is not in the preservation of flesh, it is in the persistence of goodness long after the body fails. Every incorrupt saint is a sermon in silence.
Live in such a way that your soul leaves something that does not decay. Modern science has proven that no flesh is truly eternal. Even the most perfect incorruptions eventually yield to time. Skin darkens, tissue hardens, air and light do their work. But faith has found no reason to mourn this, because the miracle was never the body's condition. It was the hope it inspired. Hope, unlike tissue, does not decay. It multiplies. It passes from one generation to another, invisible but intact. When the pilgrims light candles today before saints whose bodies have finally turned to dust, they do not despair. They whisper, "You are still here," because belief, once lit, glows longer than any flesh. In the Vatican, there is a room not for relics, but for names. Saints who left no remains at all. Burned, lost, scattered, forgotten. Yet their stories are told every year, their images repainted, their virtues remembered. In this, the Church performs the oldest miracle of all, preservation without body. Because holiness does not depend on evidence, it depends on remembrance. A saint is not a corpse that refuses to rot. It is a memory that refuses to fade. Faith, in its gentlest form, is simply remembrance stretched across time.
If science could dissect faith, it would find something remarkable. A structure that mirrors the human body. Bones, the stories we tell. Flesh, the rituals we repeat. Blood, the emotions that animate belief. And at the center, the heart, pulsing with the one truth that survives every age, that life is worth sanctifying even when it ends. The incorrupt saints, then, are not exceptions to nature, they are its metaphors. They remind us that what we call holy is often what we refuse to let die. Every era tries to explain the miracles of preservation: soil, salt, resin, temperature, chemistry. But none explain why people still kneel, still weep, still whisper in front of bones and glass. Why the human heart keeps reaching for proof that goodness can last. The truth may be simpler than miracle or mechanism. Perhaps we do not keep the saints because they are incorrupt. Perhaps they are incorrupt because we keep them. Faith, after all, is reciprocal. It preserves what it loves. And what it loves most is the idea that decay is not destiny. Close your eyes and picture the saints. Their faces behind glass, their hands folded, their peace unbroken. Now imagine the centuries of hearts that have knelt before them. Millions of beating hearts that believed. That is the real miracle. Not the still heart inside the coffin, but the living hearts outside it. The incorrupt may lie silent, but faith continues their breath. Every candle lit, every whispered prayer, every pilgrimage is another heartbeat in their long endurance. Because faith, once awakened, preserves itself. And even when the glass cracks, when the bodies crumble, when the gold fades, the invisible remains. It always has, it always will.
What remains of the saints is what remains of us. In every cathedral, beneath every painted ceiling, there is a hush that does not belong to the living. It lingers near the glass coffins, where faces sleep behind light, and bones glimmer faintly under gold. That hush is memory, the oldest prayer in the world. And if you stay long enough,
until the footsteps fade and the candles gutter, you'll see something in the glass. Not the saint, not the relic, but yourself. Because the incorrupt were never mirrors of perfection. They were mirrors of longing, and every time we gaze at them, through centuries, through faith, through reflection, we meet that part of ourselves that refuses to vanish. It begins with the face, soft, still, unchanging. It looks out at us across time, through layers of devotion and dust. We study it, the calm lips, the closed eyes, the impossible peace. And we wonder, what did they see before they closed them? Was it God? Was it fear? Was it simply the end? The Church says they gaze upon eternity. Science says they gaze upon nothing. But when we look at them, we are looking through more than glass. We are looking through history's reflection, the centuries of eyes that have looked before ours, each seeing something different, each asking the same silent question. What survives? Every incorrupt saint, every relic, every preserved bone, all of them together form a mirror in which humanity studies itself. When we stare at them, we are not seeking miracles. We are seeking resemblance, proof that what is divine in us might also resist decay. The saints, in their stillness, offer that illusion that goodness can be preserved, that peace can have a body, that death can be paused. But the reflection runs deeper. They show us not just holiness, but desire, the human need to hold, to keep, to remember. We do not look at the incorrupt because they are proof of heaven. We look because they are proof of hope. And hope, more than flesh, is what endures.
The cathedrals are quieter at night. When the lights are dimmed and the glass cases glow faintly with candlelight, the incorrupt seem to listen. They are not haunting the living, they are accompanying them, the way a shadow accompanies its source. The silence between us is not empty. It is conversation, centuries long, wordless, patient. The living speak with their eyes. The dead answer with stillness. And between the two, faith continues, like a breath shared across time. Glass is a fragile thing, a boundary, a protection, a reflection. It keeps the saints safe from touch and dust, but it also traps them between reverence and exhibition. The faithful kneel before it, the tourists photograph it, the scientists measure what lies behind it. But the glass does not judge, it only reflects. If you lean close enough, your face appears beside the saints, your living eyes next to their closed ones. For a moment, you're equals. You both exist in the same pane of time, two reflections, one alive, one remembered. And in that fragile symmetry, something remarkable happens. You see not the separation between life and death, but the continuation. The saint is not what has stopped. You are what continues. The bones, too, speak their quiet sermon. In ossuaries and catacombs, they line the walls like punctuation marks, the language of mortality written in calcium and symmetry. They remind us that structure outlives softness, that form remains after flesh, but they also remind us that all architecture, even the humankind, is meant to hold light. When candles burn beside skulls, when glass reflects gold, we remember what bones really are, frames for memory. And when faith arranges them into beauty, crosses, chandeliers, patterns of grace, it is saying something profound, that even decay can be composed into meaning. The saints do not preach it,
They embody it, silently, gracefully, endlessly.
There are always pilgrims. Some come with prayer, some with curiosity, some with the faint hope that proximity to holiness might change something inside them. They stand before coffins, glass, bones, and silence, and for a moment their own lives seem lighter, as though time itself pauses to listen with them. Every pilgrimage is really a mirror journey, not toward the saint, but toward the self. Because what we find in the stillness of the Incorrupt is not eternity, but clarity. The realization that the longing for meaning is itself holy. That faith is not found in proof, but in persistence. Every bowed head is a reflection of the first believer who knelt centuries ago. And when the pilgrim rises and leaves, another takes their place, another reflection in the endless glass. The incorrupt bodies lie behind glass and gold, but the greater church is invisible, built of memory, devotion, and silence. It stretches across continents and centuries, across believers and skeptics alike. Its foundation is not marble, but awe. Its roof is not stone, but the thought that something, anything, might survive us. Every whisper in a chapel, every candle lit before a relic, every quiet question asked in darkness adds another brick to that unseen cathedral. The saints may be its icons, but we are its architects. Because the real preservation is not below the glass, it's in the hearts that refuse to stop reflecting. At the end of this long story of saints and bones, of miracles and doubts, we return to the beginning, the body that refused to rot. What was it, really? A sign from heaven? A quirk of chemistry? Or something even more human? Our refusal to let go of those we love. The mirror turns back toward us, and in it we see both the saint and the seeker, the incorrupt and the afraid, both trying to last a little longer than time allows. The difference between them is not as great as we once thought. They resisted decay through grace. We resist despair through faith. Both are ways of saying the same thing. I am not ready to end.
Imagine the last candle flickering beside the saint's coffin. The air is cool. The church is empty. Only you and the silent body remain. You lean forward. Your breath fogs the glass for a moment, soft and round. And in that single breath, you blur the line between living and dead, your warmth clouding the saint's reflection, your life marking the barrier of eternity. Then it fades, and what remains is only the image, faint, serene, waiting. That is all faith ever does. It fogs the glass, briefly, with warmth enough to remind us we are still here. The incorrupt are not proof of heaven. They are proof of longing, that fragile, defiant spark inside every human heart that says, something in me must survive. That spark built churches. That spark preserved bodies. That spark carried bones across oceans and centuries, through doubt, through dust, through every age of reason. And it still burns, faintly, persistently, in every whisper of prayer, in every quiet act of remembrance. Because in the end, we are all reflections, flesh and glass, hope and dust, waiting for light to pass through us one more time, and when it does, for just an instant, we too will glow, like bones in candlelight, like memory behind gold, like faith itself, refusing to rot. They are gone, and yet they are here. We are here, and yet we will be gone. But the silence between us, that endures. The story ends where it began, in the hush between heartbeat and history. The saints sleep, the candles dim, and the world, for a moment, feels incorruptible. Not because it is untouched, but because, in remembering them, we remember ourselves. And that, more than any miracle of flesh, is what truly lasts.